The voicemail is 41 seconds long. I have listened to it more than 200 times, and I still cannot tell you what the sound at the end of it is. Ronald Green left it on my office phone at 11:47 at night, and by the time I played it the next morning, he had already been gone for 9 hours. His voice is calm for the first 30 seconds. He talks about the weather. He talks about the river ice. Then he stops, and there is a pause, and he says very quietly, "It is standing at the fence again." After that, there are 11 seconds of wind, and then something that is not wind, and then the message ends. Before I take you into what happened after that voicemail, let me pause for one moment. If you are listening to this on SR Bellique, Mr. Bellique, or Mr. Geronimo, and you have been here through other stories without ever pressing anything or typing anything, tonight is the night to change that. Hit subscribe, tap the like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you are listening from and what time it is on your clock right now. I read those comments during the long quiet shifts, and knowing there are people awake out there with me makes the woods feel a little less empty. Now settle in, because this one starts with a voicemail and ends somewhere I still do not like to think about. My office phone sits in a log building at the end of a gravel road outside Talkeetna, Alaska. The sign on the door says Ranger Station, and the name under the sign is mine. I had held that posting for 11 years when Ronald Green disappeared, long enough that people in town had stopped calling me by my title and started calling me by my first name, long enough that I knew every trapline, every airstrip, and every stubborn old man living alone past the end of the maintained roads. Ronald Green was the most stubborn of them all. 69 years old, built like a fence post, living in a cabin on the west bank of the Susitna River since before I was hired. He ran a small trapline, kept a smokehouse, and came into town maybe once a month for coffee, ammunition, and arguments. He was not a man who imagined things. He was not a man who called anyone at 11:47 at night. In 11 years, he had phoned my station exactly twice. Once about a wolf taking his dog, and once about a float plane that landed on his stretch of river without permission. So when I played that voicemail on the morning of October 14th, I did not laugh at it. I sat very still in my chair, and I played it again, and then I picked up the radio and called Amy Baker. Amy was 51, and had been the borough dispatcher for 2 decades. Her voice on the radio was the sound of order itself, flat and clean. The kind of voice that could tell you a plane was down or a child was lost without a single tremor. I asked her if anyone had heard from Ronald overnight. She checked her logs and said no. I asked her to note that I was heading upriver to do a welfare check, and there was a pause on her end, a pause I had never heard from Amy Baker before, and she said, "Tell me when you get there. Not if you find anything, when you get there." As if she already knew that getting there would be the whole story. The river was not frozen enough for the ice road and not open enough for the boat, which is the worst 2 weeks of the Alaskan year. So I took the long way, driving north and then walking in on the trapline trail with a pack, a rifle, and a thermos. Jason Adams came with me. Jason was 56, a ranger like me, stationed out of the Talkeetna office for most of his career. A wide, quiet man who had pulled more bodies out of the backcountry than anyone I knew. He did not talk much on a trail, which I appreciated because the forest that morning did not feel like a place for talking. I want to explain that feeling because everything that came later grew out of it. The boreal forest in mid-October is usually loud in a soft way. Ravens argue, squirrels scold. The last of the migrating birds pass overhead in ragged lines. That morning, for the last 2 miles before Ronald's cabin, there was nothing. Not silence exactly, because the wind still moved the spruce tops, but an absence underneath the wind, a hole where the animal sounds should have been. Jason noticed it before I said anything. He stopped, tilted his head, and stood there for a long moment with his hand resting on the sling of his rifle. Then he looked at me and said one word: empty. Ronald's cabin came into view at noon. Smoke should have been rising from the stovepipe, because Ronald kept a fire burning from September to May without fail, and the pipe was cold. The door was shut but not latched. His snow machine sat under its tarp. His boat was pulled up on the bank. His dog, a rangy old husky cross named Pepper, was nowhere, and Pepper never left the yard. The fence was what stopped me, though. Ronald kept a wire fence around his garden plot, chest high, strung between spruce posts. The voicemail had said, "It is standing at the fence again," meaning it had stood there before, meaning he had watched something at that fence more than once and never told a soul until the last night of his known life. 2 of the posts were snapped. Not leaned over, not pushed, snapped, sheared off at a height of about 5 feet, the way a post breaks when weight comes down on it from above. In the soft ground between the broken posts there were tracks. I have followed bear, moose, wolf, lynx, and wolverine across every kind of ground Alaska offers. I knelt beside those tracks for a long time, and I felt something in the back of my skull begin to whisper that the shape in front of me did not belong to any list I knew. The print was canine, enormous, but canine, with claw marks and 4 toes and a pad. That alone would have said wolf, the biggest wolf ever recorded maybe, but a wolf. The problem was the spacing. There were no front prints. Every track was a rear print, left, right, in a walking stride of nearly 6 feet, moving in a straight line from the fence toward the tree line the way a man walks, the way you and I walk, on 2 legs. Jason stood over me while I photographed them. He did not speak until I had finished, and when he spoke his voice had dropped into a register I had never heard him use. He said, "I saw tracks like this once, in 2003, near Cordova." And then he said the sentence that ended the first day of the search and opened everything that followed. He said, "The man those tracks were circling was never found either." We searched the cabin before the light failed. Nothing was taken. Ronald's rifle stood in its rack by the door, loaded. His wallet sat on the table beside a cold cup of coffee and a plate with 1 bite gone from a piece of smoked salmon. Whatever took him out of that cabin took him mid-meal, mid-thought, without a struggle inside the walls, and a man like Ronald Green did not walk away from a loaded rifle for anything he considered dangerous. Either he did not consider it dangerous, or he never got the chance to consider it at all. The smokehouse told a different story. The door had been torn off, not pried, torn, hinges and all, and the racks inside were stripped. An entire season of salmon and moose gone. On the ground outside lay Pepper's collar, and I am going to leave what else lay there out of this recording, because some details serve a story and some details only serve nightmares, and I promised myself when I started these recordings that I would know the difference. By the next morning, the search had a shape. Amy Baker ran coordination from town. Julie Nelson flew the river corridor in her Super Cub, 44 years old. The best bush pilot on that side of the range. A woman who could put a plane down on a gravel bar the length of a tennis court. Ryan Carter drove up from the trooper post, 33, new to Alaska. All procedure and clean boots. The kind of young trooper the backcountry either educates or breaks. And Gary Perez came, though nobody had called him. Gary was 47, a hunting guide out of Talkeetna, and he showed up at the staging area with his own gear, his own dogs, and a face like a closed door. He pulled me aside before the morning briefing and asked one question. He asked, "Were the tracks walking upright?" Not, "Did you find tracks?" Not, "What did you find?" Were the tracks walking upright? When I did not answer fast enough, he nodded slowly, the way a man nods at news he has been waiting years to hear, and said, "Then you need to hear about Cordova, and Adams needs to be there when I tell it, because he will call me a liar otherwise, and he was there for the after, even if he was not there for the during." That night, in the ranger station with the stove ticking and the windows black, Gary Perez told the room about Cordova, 2003. He had been guiding a spring bear hunt out of a camp on the Copper River Delta. A client wandered from camp at dusk to photograph the light on the mudflats. They heard him shout, once, a shout Gary described as more surprised than afraid, and then nothing. The search found his camera. The last photographs on it were of the tree line, ordinary pictures, until the final frame. Gary said the final frame showed the space between 2 spruce trees, and in that space there was a shape, and the shape was tall, and the shape had ears. He said the state investigators wrote it off as a bear standing upright with motion blur. He said he had guided bear hunts for 20 years and he knew what a standing bear looked like. And a standing bear does not have a muzzle that long. And a standing bear does not have eyes that sit forward on the front of its face like a wolf, like a man, like a thing that judges distance because it runs its prey down. Jason Adams sat through the whole account with his jaw tight, and when Gary finished, Jason did not call him a liar. Jason said, "I processed the tracks at that scene. I measured a 6-foot stride. I wrote bear in my report because my supervisor told me nothing else would be accepted, and I have thought about that report every October since, because October is when it happened, and October is when it always happens." Then he laid a folder on the table, an old paper folder soft with age, and said, "Skagway, 1987. I pulled this from the archive box in the crawl space this afternoon because I remembered it existed and I hoped I was wrong about what was in it. I read the Skagway file out loud to the room, and reading it felt like reading a description of my own week, written 39 years early. A trapper on the Taya River, living alone, reports to a neighbor about something watching his cabin at night, something at the fence. Those were the words in the file, something at the fence. Then a disappearance in the third week of October. Then a smokehouse emptied, a door torn off, tracks with no front prints, and a search that found, 12 days later and 9 miles away, one boot, 40 feet up a cottonwood tree, wedged into a fork no climbing animal in Alaska could reach with that kind of weight. The room was quiet when I finished. Sharon Mitchell broke the quiet. Sharon was 60, Ronald's younger sister, down from Fairbanks, and she had been sitting in the corner all evening with her hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from. She said, "Ronnie knew." Everyone turned. She said, "He wrote me in September. He said an animal had been coming to the fence at night since the salmon run ended. He said it stood there and watched the cabin, and he said," and Sharon's voice broke on this, "he said it was not a bear and he had stopped trying to convince himself it was. He started leaving fish on the fence post for it. He thought if he fed it they had an understanding. He thought it was like feeding a camp jay. He told me," Sharon said, "the wild only bothers you when it is hungry, so keep it fed and it will keep its distance." I have carried a version of that saying my whole career. Every ranger has. We say it to campers about bears. Keep your food locked up, never feed wildlife, because a fed animal loses its fear, and an animal that loses its fear starts coming closer. Ronald knew that rule better than any man alive, and he broke it, because the thing at his fence frightened him so deeply that he reached for the only bargain he could think of. He taught it that his fence was a place where food appeared. He taught it his schedule, his lights, his habits. He taught it the pattern of his life, and a predator that learns your pattern does not need to be lucky anymore. It only needs to be patient. Ryan Carter fought the story hardest, and I respected him for it, because fighting it was his job. On the second night, he spread the case photographs across the station table and built the official version out loud, piece by piece, for all of us to hear. A brown bear, late for the den, food conditioned by an old man leaving fish on a post. The bear takes the man, empties the smokehouse, and the strange tracks are overstep, rear paws landing in the prints of the front paws, an old trick of soft ground that has fooled better eyes than ours. It was a good version, it was clean, and it required nothing new to exist in the world. Then Amy Baker, without a word, slid one photograph back across the table to him, the close frame of the stride line beside my folding rule, and tapped the measurement with one finger, and said, "Show me the bear with a 34-inch hip height that oversteps into a 70-inch stride, trooper, and I will type your version myself and sign it as gospel." Ryan looked at that photograph for a long time. He never built the version again. Laura Roberts arrived on the third day. 39, a wildlife researcher out of the university in Anchorage, sent officially to evaluate the tracks for the predator response file. She cast 3 prints in dental stone and measured everything twice, and I watched the confidence drain out of her posture with each measurement. On the third evening, she set a cast on the table under the lamp and said, "I am going to tell you what the data says, and then I am going to tell you that I do not believe my own data. The foot that made this print belongs to a canid. The gait that spaced these prints belongs to a habitual biped. Those 2 sentences cannot both be true, and yet here is the cast, and there is the stride map, and I have remeasured both 9 times. Then she looked around the room at all of us and asked the question a researcher is never supposed to ask. She asked, "What is it that you people are not telling me?" Before anyone could decide how to answer her, the radio on my belt crackled, and Julie Nelson's voice came through from the Super Cub somewhere over the river in the last usable light. Her voice was steady the way a pilot's voice stays steady, which is to say it was a lid on a boiling pot. She said, "Station, I have found Ronald's coat. I know it is his, it is the red wool one. There is no other coat like it on this river." Then a pause, engine drone, and the sentence that ended the day. She said, "It is 12 miles upstream from the cabin, and it is not on the ground. It is hanging in the top of a spruce tree, and station, the tree is 80 feet tall." The spruce stood on a gravel bench above a nameless creek, and it took us most of the 4th day to reach it on foot. Ryan Carter walked point with me on the last stretch, and I watched Alaska educate him mile by mile. He had started the search talking about protocols and grids and probability cones. By the time we stood under that tree, he had stopped talking altogether, because probability cones do not put a dead man's coat 80 feet up a living tree, and no protocol he had been taught contained a page for the way the woods felt on that bench. I need you to understand the feeling, because it was the fence feeling again, magnified. The absence, no birds, no squirrels, no movement, a bubble of held breath maybe half a mile wide with that spruce at its center. Gary's dogs would not enter it. 2 experienced sled dogs and a hound that had run down wounded bears, and all 3 of them stopped at an invisible line, sat down in the moss, and refused, trembling, to take another step. Gary did not force them. He looked at the line they would not cross the way a man looks at a fence, tied them off, and came on with us. And I noticed he chambered around to do it. Laura climbed with Ryan, belaying her, because she insisted, because she said evidence recovered by the person who will analyze it is evidence that cannot be argued with. She was in that tree for 20 minutes. When she came down with the coat sealed in a bag, her face had gone somewhere beyond pale. She waited until we had walked an hour back toward the dogs before she would speak, and then she said, the coat was not snagged, it was placed. The branches around it were unbroken. Something carried it up the trunk and laid it across a fork, deliberately, the way you would lay a coat over the back of a chair. And there were marks in the bark, going up, spaced like a ladder built for something with a 9-foot reach. That night we camped in a tight ring on the gravel with a fire we kept high, and that night it spoke to us. I have no better verb. It began a little after 1 in the morning. From the ridge north of the creek, a howl, but a howl is only the container for what came out of that ridge. It started like a wolf, and then bent wrong, dropped into a register I felt in my sternum rather than heard, and ended in a series of short rising notes that no wolf on this earth produces, notes with shape, with intent, notes that rose at the end the way a question rises. The dogs answered it with screaming, not barking, screaming, and then from the ridge south of us behind our camp a second voice answered the first. 2 of them. Whatever the night was holding, it was holding too. And they were talking across our camp, over our heads, about us. Jason Adams sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees and tears moving down his weathered face without a single change in his expression, and he said quietly to no one, that is the sound from Cordova. 23 years I have told myself I imagined it, and there it is, and I did not imagine it, and that poor man in 2003 heard it as the last sound of his life. Sharon Mitchell sat wrapped in a sleeping bag and said nothing at all, but her lips were moving, and I believe she was talking to her brother. The voices moved through the small hours. That was the worst part, tracking them by ear, realizing the intervals were shortening, realizing the 2 of them were circling in opposite directions like a drawstring closing. Ryan Carter wanted to fire warning shots. Gary put a hand on the barrel of the trooper's rifle and pushed it down and said, son, right now they are curious. Noise tells them where every one of us is standing, and it does not tell them anything they do not already know, and it spends ammunition we may want very much before sunrise. That is a guide's arithmetic, and it was correct, and I have thought many times since about how close we came to spending those rounds on the empty trees. Just before 4, the voices stopped, and the silence that replaced them was worse. And into that silence came footsteps, bipedal, unhurried, crossing the gravel bar on the far side of the creek, 40 yards from the firelight. Each step a distinct crunch with a long pause between, the stride of something enormous that wanted, that chose, to be heard. We could not see past the light. It knew we could not see past the light. It walked the full length of the bar, north to south, and at the southern end it stopped, and for the length of 10 heartbeats the night held completely still. And then from directly across the creek came a sound I will take into the ground with me. It exhaled, long, slow, heavy, the way a horse exhales, but deeper, a breath from a chest the size of a barrel, released softly across 40 yards of dead air so that every one of us would understand exactly how close it had come, and exactly how quietly it could do so. Then nothing more until sunrise. In the gray light we crossed the creek, and the tracks were there in the wet sand, and Laura photographed them with her hands shaking, and Ryan Carter stood over them repeating the words no, 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 under his breath like a prayer that had stopped working. The prints ran the length of the bar exactly as our ears had mapped them. At the southern end where it had stood and breathed at us, the prints turned and they were pointed at the camp, and they were 14 inches from heel to claw, and pressed into the sand beside them was a knee. It had knelt at the edge of the water and watched us at eye level through the gap under the alders, below the reach of the firelight. And none of us, not one, had felt those eyes even as we all stared blind into the shadow above. We pulled out that morning. There was no vote and no discussion. Julie flew Sharon and Laura back to town in 2 trips off the gravel bar while the rest of us walked out. And the walk was 11 hours, and for 11 hours the forest stayed empty around us, that moving bubble of held breath traveling with us like an escort, and I understood, somewhere in the 9th hour, with a clarity I have never been able to soften since, that we were not walking out because we had chosen to leave. We were walking out because we were being walked out, herded, politely, firmly, off a claim. We reached the trucks at dusk, and it was Amy Baker's voice on the radio. Steady Amy, unshakable Amy, that met us there. And her voice was not steady, and what she said turned every drop of relief in my body to ice water. She said, "Do not come back to the station yet. I came out at lunch to run the flag up, and there are tracks in the yard. They are around the whole building. They are under every window. And there is fish, a whole dried salmon, laid on the front step like a delivery, and I am inside with the door barred, and I have been listening to something walk the gravel for an hour. And it wants me to hear it, and please, please tell me you are close." We covered the last 40 minutes to the station in 25, and I will tell you plainly that I do not remember the drive. I remember Gary loading his rifle in the passenger seat with movements gone very small and precise, and I remember Jason behind us on the radio with Amy the entire way, keeping her talking, keeping her voice in the truck with us like a lifeline running both directions. The yard was empty when our headlights swept it. Amy was unhurt. The tracks were exactly as she had described. A full, slow circuit of the building, pausing at each window, the stride prints pressed deep at every pane as if the walker had stood a long while at each one, looking in at the maps, the desks, the photographs of the search grid pinned to the corkboard. Looking in, I have come to believe, at the shape and structure of the effort against it. The salmon on the step was one of Ronald's. His mark was on the tail. 12 days gone. 12 miles of wilderness away, and something had carried a fish from a dead man's smokehouse through the forest and laid it on my doorstep. Laura Roberts said it was scavenged goods dropped by chance. She said it in the flat voice of a researcher reciting the explanation of record, and then she sat down on the step beside the fish and said, in a completely different voice, "It is a message." It fed the old man to buy his fence line, and now it is telling us the same offer stands. Keep the fish, stay out of the trees. Everyone walks away. She looked up at me and asked, "What do we write in the file?" And I told her the truth, which is that the file would say bear, because the file always says bear, because Skagway said bear in 1987 and Cordova said bear in 2003, and the file is not written to hold anything else. We found Ronald Green on the 15th day, and I will give you only what the record gives. Julie spotted the red of his other coat, the one he had been wearing, on a scree slope at the head of the nameless creek, 300 vertical feet above the valley floor, in terrain a 69-year-old man does not climb, and no animal known to inhabit this continent can climb while carrying a burden. Recovery took 2 days. The finding of record lists environmental exposure. The finding of record lists no witnesses. The finding of record is 1 page long, and I signed it, and the signing of it is the heaviest thing I have done in a uniform. Julie Nelson flew the recovery crew in, and on the second pass over the scree she saw something she reported only to me, off the record, on the ground, with the engine still ticking as it cooled. She said that as she banked over the head of the creek, low, maybe 400 feet, something moved on the ridge above the slope, upright, rust brown against the first snow. She said it did not run and it did not hide, and running and hiding are the only 2 behaviors a pilot ever sees from wildlife under a low aircraft. She said it stood in the open with its head tilted back, tracking her the way a spectator tracks a slow ball across the sky, and as she came around for the second pass it simply stepped backward into the timber, one long, unhurried stride, and was gone the way a thought is gone. Julie has 9,000 hours over this range. She has seen every animal Alaska holds from every altitude. She filed nothing, and she asked me to log her fuel and her hours and nothing else. And then she sat in the cockpit alone for a while before she flew home. Sharon Mitchell came to the station before she flew home to Fairbanks. She stood a long time at the window her brother's watcher had stood at, looking out at the tree line, and she said, "He thought he had an understanding. All winter he is leaving it fish. And he is telling himself, the wild only bothers you when it is hungry. Keep it fed and it keeps its distance." She turned around and her eyes were dry in the way that is far past crying, and she said, "The thing that has restructured every night shift of my life since." She said, "But that is backwards, do you understand? Feeding is not distance, feeding is training." He thought he was buying a fence, and he was teaching a mind, a real mind, patient and watching. where the food came from, and when the lights went out, and how long a stubborn old man will stand at his own fence line staring into the trees before he decides the night is empty. He drew at a map of himself. And then she looked past me, at the search grid still pinned to the corkboard, at the routes and camps and schedules of 8 more people laid out in colored pins, and she said, "And now you have drawn it another one. The area at the head of the creek is closed now. The closure order cites unstable terrain, and the order comes up for review every year, and every year I renew it, and no one above me asks why, because Jason Adams retired last spring and took the Skagway file with him, and the only other people who could ask are the 7 who were there, and they do not ask." Ryan Carter transferred to Anchorage. He calls me every October 14th, and we do not say much. Gary Perez still guides, but he has dropped every unit on the west bank of the river from his permit, and when clients ask him why, he tells them the fishing is better elsewhere. Laura Roberts published nothing. Her casts sit in a locked cabinet in Anchorage under a label that reads Unresolved Canid, oversized, and once a year she drives up, and we sit with coffee, and she asks me if it has come back to the fence, and I tell her the truth. The truth is this. 10 nights ago, in the first week of this October, I stayed late at the station finishing the winter reports. A little after 11 I looked up from the desk, out through the window into the yard light, and the yard was empty, and the tree line beyond it was a wall of stacked shadow, and I could not see anything in it, and I want to be very clear with you that I could not see anything in it. But the forest had gone silent in that specific way, that held breath way, that absence under the wind, and on the glass of the window, at a height well over 7 feet, there was fog. 2 patches of it, blooming and fading, slow and even and patient. The breath of something standing inches from the pane, watching me the way it once watched an old man who believed he had an understanding. I did not go to the window. I did not reach for the rifle. I sat where I was, in the light, in plain view, and I made myself finish the report with steady hands while the fog on the glass bloomed and faded, because Gary's arithmetic still holds. It already knows where I am standing. It has always known. And when I finally looked up again, sometime past midnight, the fog was gone. The birds were arguing in the spruce tops, and on the front step of my station, laid straight and neat and facing the door, there was a fresh salmon. I have not touched it. It is still there tonight, freezing to the boards while I record this, because I keep hearing Sharon's voice telling me her brother thought he was buying a fence when he was drawing a map, and I understand now that there are only 2 kinds of people on this river, the ones the forest has not noticed yet, and the ones who have already been given their first fish and must now decide, with the whole long winter still ahead, whether to take it. If this story reached you the way it reached me, share it with someone who thinks the woods are empty, and I will see you in the next recording. Stay on the trails, stay in the light, and if something ever starts leaving you gifts at the fence line, do not flatter yourself that you have an understanding. It does. The claw marks on the hood of my patrol truck measure 11 inches from the top of the cut to the bottom. I measured them this morning with the steel tape from the maintenance shed, and then I measured them again because the first number did not seem possible. 4 parallel grooves, deep enough to peel the paint and bite into the metal underneath, spaced wider than my open hand. Whatever dragged its claws across that hood stood over the engine block the way a man stands over a kitchen counter. The truck is a full-sized pickup. The hood sits at the height of my chest. I have been staring at those marks for an hour now, drinking coffee that went cold a long time ago, trying to decide how to begin telling you all of this. So I will begin with the marks, because they are real, because they are outside my window right now, and because everything else I am about to tell you leads either toward them or away from them. Before we go any deeper into the trees, let me ask one small favor. If you enjoy long, true-style narrations like this one, please take a second to subscribe, tap the like button, and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people. You can find my work on Tsar Bellico, on Mr. Bellico, and on Mr. Geronimo. All right, lights low, volume up. Here is what happened to me in Alaska. For most of my adult life, I have worked as a park ranger and backcountry patrol officer in the state of Alaska. I have been stationed in 3 places that matter to this story. Talkeetna, in the shadow of the big mountain, Cordova, out on the coast where the rainforest drops into the Sound, and Skagway, up at the top of the inside passage where the old Gold Rush Trail climbs into the passes. 3 postings, 3 sets of files I was never able to close. 1 animal that I no longer believe is an animal at all. I should tell you who I am, though not the way reports begin. I grew up in the lower 48, in flat farm country where the horizon never hid anything, And I came north at 26 because I wanted a job where the map still had blank spots. The academy taught me search patterns, bear behavior, cold water rescue, and how to write an incident report that a lawyer could not bend. Nobody taught me what to do when the incident refuses to fit the report. Nobody taught me that there are things in the timber that read you back, that study your habits the way you study theirs, and that keep better files on us than we will ever keep on them. I had to learn that alone, one posting at a time, and the tuition was my sleep, my certainty, and eventually, as you will hear, my belief that I was ever the one doing the investigating. Talkeetna came first. I was in my early 30s, fit, confident, and certain that the woods held nothing I could not handle with training, a radio, and a sidearm. The station assigned me to river patrols and trail maintenance along the drainages south of the range. It is enormous country. From the air it looks like a green ocean with rivers braided through it like veins of silver. From the ground it feels like standing inside something that is aware of you. The first strange report crossed my desk in late August of my second year. A fishing guide called the station to say that something had torn apart his skiff cache on a gravel bar up the Talkeetna River. Not a bear, he insisted. He had lived around bears his whole life. Bears rip and bite and flatten things with their weight. This was different. The aluminum cooler had been opened, he said. Not crushed. Opened. The latches were bent upward, the way they bend when fingers work them. My supervisor laughed it off and told me to log it as probable brown bear activity. I typed the words probable brown bear activity, and I remember pausing with my hands over the keyboard, because the photographs the guide sent us showed the cooler sitting upright and empty, and beside it, pressed into the wet sand, a single track. I want to describe that track carefully because I would spend the next 20 years seeing versions of it. It was 17 inches long. It had an elongated heel like the print of a barefoot man, but the front of the track splayed into 4 heavy toes, each one tipped with a triangular divot where a claw had punched into the sand. It was not a bear track. Bear tracks show 5 toes and the claws register far ahead of the pad. It was not a wolf track. A wolf track fits inside a coffee mug ring compared to this. It looked, and I am choosing these words with care, like something that could not decide whether it was a man or a hound had stood there on 2 legs and watched the river. I drove out to that gravel bar on my next patrol. The track was gone, dissolved by rain, but the willows along the bank were broken at a height of about 8 feet, snapped inward, as if something tall had pushed through them without bothering to lower its head. I stood there in the drizzle with my hand resting on my sidearm, and for the first time in my career the country did not feel empty. It felt occupied. That night, back at the station, an old trapper named Ronald Green was waiting for me on the porch. Ronald was 69 years old that summer, a lean, weathered man who had run lines in that drainage since before the highway existed. He did not come to the station often. When he did, people listened. He asked me if I had been up to the gravel bar. I said I had. He asked me if I had found anything. I said the rain had taken it. He nodded slowly, looked out at the tree line across the runway, and said the sentence that has followed me through 3 towns and 2 decades. He said, "When it stands up, do not run. It wants you to run." Then he walked down the steps, got into his truck, and drove away, and he would not say another word about it for a full year. I did not sleep well that autumn. Part of it was the schedule. Late-season patrols in that country mean long hours, wet boots, and moose hunters who need rescuing from their own decisions. But part of it was the tree line. I had started watching it. On river patrols, I would catch myself scanning the banks not for hazards, not for wildlife, but for a shape, a tall shape. I did not have a name for it yet. I only had a track dissolved by rain, a bent cooler latch, and an old man telling me not to run from something he refused to describe. The winter passed quietly. The next disturbance came in June, and it came from the sled dog kennels north of town. A musher called the station at 2 in the morning, and dispatch patched her through to my cabin because I was the duty officer. She was whispering. I remember that clearly. A grown woman, tough as boot leather, alone in her kitchen with the lights off, whispering into the phone that something was standing at the edge of her dog yard and that her dogs, all 26 of them, were silent. Anyone who has spent a night near a working kennel knows that silence is not what sled dogs do. They sing at sirens, at ravens, at each other, at nothing. 26 huskies falling mute at the same moment is not a mood, it is a verdict. I took the truck out with the light bar off and the windows down. The last half-mile to her property runs through black spruce, the skinny, ragged kind that grows in the muskeg, and my headlights made the trunks strobe past like fence pickets. When I pulled into the yard, every dog was pressed flat against the back wall of its house. Not barking, not pacing, flattened, the way dogs flatten under thunder. The musher met me on the porch with a rifle she did not remember picking up. She pointed at the birch stand beyond the yard and said it had been right there, at the edge of the trees, and that it had been watching the house, not the dogs. She kept repeating that part, not the dogs, the house. Her bedroom window faces that stand. She described it in the flat voice people use when they have decided not to be believed. 7 feet, she said, maybe taller. Built through the shoulders like a draft horse. A neck that carried the head forward and low. Ears upright. And a muzzle. She said the word muzzle, and then she laughed once, a small broken sound, and said that muzzles belong on dogs, and dogs do not stand on 2 legs and stare at a window with their arms hanging at their sides. We walked the tree line together at first light. I found the impressions in the moss where something heavy had stood, shifting its weight, for what must have been a long time. The moss was crushed in 2 places, side by side, each the size of a dinner plate, each shaped wrong for any animal in the manual they issue you at the academy. There was one more detail from that night at the kennels, and I left it out of the report entirely, because there was no language in the report for it. As we stood on her porch just before first light, from the birch stand came a whistle. 2 notes, low then high, the exact 2-note whistle the musher used to call her lead dog in from the yard. Her whistle, note for note. She grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise it and said, I have never whistled that with anyone else on this property. The lead dog, a 10-year-old veteran named Birch, lifted his head at the sound, took 1 step toward the trees and then stopped, and shook, and crawled backward into his house, and would not lead a team again for the rest of that season. Whatever stood in those birches had listened to her routines long enough to learn them. It had practiced, and it had chosen the moment when an officer of the law was standing beside her to demonstrate, which I understood, much later, was not an accident. It was never performing for her. It was performing for me. I logged the incident as an unidentified large animal, probable moose in poor light. I want you to understand something about that report and every report like it that I would file over the following years. I did not write those words because I believed them. I wrote them because there is no box on the form for the truth, and because the one time I hinted at the truth in an official document, my supervisor took me aside and asked kindly whether the isolation was getting to me and whether I wanted to talk to somebody. So the paperwork lied, and I kept my eyes open, and the summer rolled on toward the day that Julie Nelson walked into the drainage with a camera and a bear bell and did not walk out. Julie Nelson was 44 years old, a landscape photographer out of Anchorage with a good reputation and better boots. She checked in at the ranger station on a Tuesday morning in late July, filed a route plan for 3 days along the benches above Clear Creek, and smiled at me across the counter while I stamped her permit. I remember the smile because of what came after. You always remember the last ordinary thing. She was due out Friday evening. Friday came and went. Saturday morning her sister called the station, and by Saturday afternoon I was leading the hasty team up the Clear Creek Trail with 2 volunteers and a dog handler behind me. We found her camp on the second bench, and I will tell you exactly what we found because I wrote it down that night with shaking hands, and I have kept that notebook through every move since. The tent was intact, zipped from the outside. Her sleeping bag was inside, still holding the loose shape of a person, the way a bag does when someone slides out of it carefully. Her camera, a heavy professional body worth more than my monthly pay, sat on a flat rock beside the fire ring, lens cap off, pointed at the tree line to the north. Her food hung properly in a bear bag 50 yards downwind, untouched. Her boots were gone, everything else was there. The dog took a line from the tent straight north, moving fast and low, and then, about 400 yards into the timber, that dog stopped as if it had run into glass. It backed up, it turned circles. It pressed itself against its handler's legs, a seasoned search dog with over 30 fines, and it refused, absolutely refused to take another step north. The handler had never seen anything like it. He said the dog was not confused. Confused dogs cast around for scent. He said the dog had the scent strong and would not follow it, and that there is a difference, and the difference matters. While the handler settled his dog, I interviewed the 2 volunteers who had swept the eastern flank of the camp. And one of them, a quiet carpenter from town, showed me something on his phone that he had almost decided not to mention. A photograph of a spruce trunk taken at the edge of the camp clearing. At a height of 9.5 feet, the bark had been stripped in 4 parallel gouges, and packed into the sap at the top of the gouges was a tuft of hair. Not fur, I want to be precise. Fur is what you find on a bear rub, dense and woolly. This was hair, coarse and straight, 6 inches long, a gray-brown color that matched nothing in the identification guides. I collected it in an evidence bag with hands that I kept steady through pure professional vanity. The bag went to the wildlife lab in Fairbanks with the routine samples that autumn. The results came back for every sample except that one. When I called to ask, a lab technician put me on hold for a long time, and then a different voice came on, an older voice, and told me the sample had been consumed in testing, and that the test was inconclusive, and that I should resubmit if I obtained more material. And then that older voice paused and asked, in a tone I have thought about for 15 years, "Where exactly did you say this was collected?" I told him. He thanked me and hung up, and no paperwork from that submission was ever recoverable again. Not by me, not by my supervisor, not by the records office. I am not telling you there is a conspiracy. I am telling you the file drawer swallowed it, and file drawers, in my experience, only swallow what someone has taught them to swallow. I went north alone while the team held the line. I told them it was procedure. It was not procedure. It was something in me that needed to see. The timber up there is old white spruce, widely spaced, with a floor of deep moss that swallows sound. Walking through it feels like walking through a photograph of a forest rather than a forest. 200 yards past the point where the dog quit, I found the first boot. It was standing upright in the moss, laces still tied, positioned neatly, toe pointed north, as if inviting me to continue. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because these stories are worthless if I am not honest. I felt observed. Not the vague prickle you get alone in the woods. I mean the specific directional physical certainty that eyes were on me and that the eyes were above my own height and that they were to my left. I turned my head slowly. Between 2 spruce trunks, perhaps 60 yards out, stood a shape that my mind tried 3 separate explanations for in the space of 1 second. Stump, bear, man. It was none of them. It was too tall for the first, too upright for the second, and too wide, too wrong, too crowned with ears for the third. It stood in the deep shade with its long head lowered, and though I could not see its eyes, I could feel the attention pouring off it the way you feel heat from a wood stove across a room. Ronald Green's sentence arrived in my skull like a hand on my shoulder. When it stands up, do not run. It was already standing. I did not run. I did not draw. I stood in that mossy cathedral with my heart slamming, and I spoke out loud, and what I said was, "We are here for the woman. Just the woman." I cannot tell you why I said it. I can only tell you what happened next. The shape turned, without hurry, in a movement that rippled from the shoulders down, and it walked away north, on 2 legs, for the 11 or 12 steps it took to pass out of my sight behind the trees. Its stride was longer than I am tall. It made no sound at all in the moss. Nothing that size should be silent. Silence like that is not an absence. It is a skill. We found Julie Nelson the next morning, 3 miles north, sitting against a boulder at the edge of a slide path, alive. Dehydrated, feverish, bootless, her feet wrapped in strips of her own jacket. The medical specialists in Anchorage kept her for a week. She had no memory of leaving the tent. Her last memory of that night was a sound outside the fabric, a slow, enormous breathing, and a smell like wet dog and turned earth, and a feeling, she said, of being chosen for something and then, for reasons she would never know, set aside. I visited her once in the recovery ward in Anchorage, on my own time, out of uniform. She was sitting up by the window with her wrapped feet propped on a chair, and when I came in she did not ask how the search had gone or what we had found at her camp. She asked me one question immediately as if she had been saving it. She asked, "Did you talk to it?" I stood in that doorway with my hat in my hands and I felt the floor of the ordinary world tilt a few degrees, because I had told no one what I said in that stand of spruce, not the team, not my supervisor, not the report. I asked her what she meant. She said that on the second night, when she was sitting against the boulder too weak to walk, drifting in and out, she heard footsteps circling her, huge and soft in the moss, around and around, all night, and near dawn the circling stopped, and a voice came out of the timber. Not words she could repeat, she said, more like the shape of words, pressed down into a register that she felt in her breastbone rather than heard. But the shape of it, she said, the rhythm of it, was, "We are here for the woman, just the woman." And then she looked at me, this rational, gifted, wounded woman, and she said, "It was doing your voice, Ranger. It was practicing you." And I do not remember leaving that room, but the nurses tell me I thanked them very politely on the way out, so at least the training holds even when the man does not. She never photographed a forest again. Her camera stayed in our evidence room for a year, unclaimed. Out of duty, I developed the roll. 35 frames of ordinary landscape, and one final frame, the 36th, taken at night with the flash on. I have never shown that frame to anyone. I am not going to describe it to you tonight. Some things I am still not ready to say out loud, and that photograph is the reason I requested a transfer to the coast, to Cordova, where I told myself the story would end. The story did not end. The story had only learned my name. Cordova sits on the eastern edge of Prince William Sound, a fishing town with no road connecting it to the outside world. You arrive by boat or by plane, or you do not arrive. The country behind it is temperate rainforest, hemlock and Sitka spruce hung with moss, and behind that rises the ice. I arrived in October, told myself the rain would wash Talkeetna out of me, and for 2 full years it nearly did. The station there was small. Amy Baker ran dispatch, 51 years old, sharp as a filleting knife, a woman who had raised 3 kids and buried a fisherman husband and had no patience left in her body for nonsense. Jason Adams was the senior ranger, 56, a slab of a man who had worked the district for 2 decades and knew every drainage from the Copper River Delta to the Sound. They were good people. I want that on the record. Whatever you think, by the end of this chapter, they were good people. The trouble began at the fish camps in my 3rd autumn. Subsistence families run smokehouses along the sloughs east of town, and that fall, something started working the camps at night. Not a bear, and I say that with authority now because I documented every scene myself. Bears smash, bears gorge. Bears leave a signature of glorious, stupid destruction. This thing lifted whole racks of salmon out of smokehouses without disturbing the structures. It unhooked latches. At one camp it removed a door from its hinges and leaned the door against the outside wall, neatly, the way a workman does when he intends to put it back. Amy started calling it the polite one over the radio, as a joke. The joke lasted until the night of the first vocalization. Before the joke died, we had one more fish camp scene, the worst of them, and it was the worst precisely because nothing was broken. The Canuck family ran the oldest smokehouse on the slough, and one October morning the grandmother called Amy, calm as church, and asked us to come look at her drying racks. When Jason and I arrived, the racks were full, nothing taken, but every fish, all 100 and some of them, had been turned, rotated on their hooks, gently, so that every salmon on every rack now faced the tree line to the east, the way a congregation faces an altar. The grandmother stood beside me looking at them and said, in Ayak country there were old stories about a tall neighbor, and her mother had told her the rule for the tall neighbor, and the rule was this: it never takes anything the first 3 times. It counts. She would not tell me what her mother said happened after the 3rd time. She only had her grandsons dismantle the smokehouse that same week, 60 years of seasons in those blackened boards, and the family moved their operation 5 miles up the coast. And the grandmother looked at me as they loaded the truck and said, you should count too, Ranger, you of all people. I did not understand her then. I had lost count years before, back in Talkeetna, and something in the timber had not. I was at the station late, filing the fish camp photographs, when the radio picked up a transmission from a signer anchored up Nelson Bay. The captain keyed his mic and simply held it open, and through the speaker, across a black stretch of water, came a sound I had never heard in 20 years of wild country and have spent every year since trying to unhear. It began as a wolf howl. Any Alaskan knows a wolf howl. But a wolf howl rises and holds and falls in a curve, and this sound broke the curve. Halfway through, it bent, it thickened, and it collapsed into something with syllables in it. I am choosing that word deliberately, syllables, a rhythm and a stress pattern, rising at the end like a question, delivered in a register so deep the station speaker buzzed against its housing. Amy stood up from her console. She looked at me across the dim room and she said, that is a voice. And I said nothing, because she was right, and both of us understood that agreeing out loud would make it true. Jason drove out with me the next morning to walk the shoreline of Nelson Bay. He was quiet in the truck, which was not like him. At the trailhead he sat with his hands on the wheel and told me a story he had kept for 19 years. His first winter in the district, he had seen something cross the road in his headlights south of the airport. It crossed in 2 strides. It was upright. He had reported it as a bear and then had requested, that same week, to never again be assigned the winter night patrol, a request everyone assumed was about the loneliness. It was not about the loneliness, he told me. It was about the way it turned its head as it crossed. Animals caught in headlights look at the light, he said. This looked at the driver. The winter that followed was the worst of my career, And I need you to understand the shape of it, because the shape is the horror. Nothing attacked us. Nothing was killed. What happened instead was a slow, methodical escalation of presence, as if the thing in the timber had decided to introduce itself one sense at a time. First came the tracks. After every fresh snowfall that December, a line of prints appeared along the boundary of town. Not in town, along the boundary, tracing it, the way a surveyor walks a property line, 17 inches, elongated heel, 4 clawed toes, a walking stride of just under 6 feet. I mapped them. Over 1 month, the line of tracks described a nearly complete circle around Cordova, closed everywhere except for one gap, a deliberate gap, directly behind the ranger station. Then came the knocking. Heavy, spaced, woody impacts from the timber at night, always in patterns of 3, answered minutes later from a different bearing, as if 2 of them were talking across the valley. Ryan Carter heard them first. Ryan was 33, our seasonal tech, a cheerful, methodical kid who ran the trail camera program, and the knocking offended him professionally. Things that make sound can be recorded, he said. Things that leave tracks can be photographed. He treated the whole business as an equipment problem, and I let him, because his confidence was a warmer room than my dread. Ryan salted the boundary gap behind the station with 6 cameras. Good ones, cell-linked, infrared, staggered heights. For 11 nights they captured marten, deer, 1 lynx, and snow falling through the beam like static. On the 12th night, at 11 minutes past 3, all 6 cameras triggered within the same 90 seconds, and every single frame, all 140 of them, was blocked. Not dim, not blurry, blocked by something pressed against each lens in turn. Fur, out of focus, filling the frame. 6 cameras, spread across 400 yards of timber, visited in an order that worked from the outside in, finishing with the camera closest to the station wall. Ryan stopped joking after that. He did something smarter. He measured. The cameras were mounted at heights between 4 and 9 feet, and the 9th-foot camera had been approached, covered, and released without being knocked off its bracket, which meant, he said quietly, that whatever covered it was working at a comfortable reach above 9 feet. And he closed his laptop and asked me, for the first time, what I had really seen up north in Talkeetna. I told him all of it. The cooler, the kennels, the boot standing upright in the moss, the shape between the spruces, the photograph I will not describe. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished he said the thing that people always say when the file drawer in their mind finally runs out of folders. He said, "But that is a dogman. Those are Midwest stories. Michigan, Wisconsin. There is no such thing up here." And from the timber behind the station, close, maybe 40 yards, in the lightless gap between 2 spruce boughs heavy with snow, something exhaled. Long, wet, and vast, like a horse, if a horse were the size of the night itself. We did not go outside. I want to be honest about that too. 2 trained men, armed, with a truck 20 feet from the door, and we stood at the window with the lights off until dawn, and the last thing the melting snow preserved in the morning was the impression of 2 enormous feet, side by side, facing the glass, 7 strides from where we had been standing. It had watched us, watching for it. It had stood in the one shadow we could not read. Jason Adams retired that spring, 18 months early, and moved to Arizona, to the desert, to a place with a horizon in every direction. At his farewell dinner, he shook my hand, held it a moment too long, and said, "It does not want the town, it wants witnesses," and then he laughed as if he had said something else entirely, and got on the plane. I need to set down one more thing from that Cordova winter. The thing I have never told anyone, not Amy, not Ryan, not the recorder, until tonight. In February, during the deep cold snap, I worked a late shift alone at the station, and at some point after midnight the phone rang on the public line. I answered with the standard greeting. The line was open, wind on it, distant and beneath the wind, breathing. Enormous, slow, patient breathing. The same breathing Julie Nelson described through her tent fabric a decade earlier. I said hello twice. And then the caller did something no prank has ever done and no explanation has ever survived. It played me back to myself. My own voice, my own standard greeting, Ranger Station, this is the duty officer, repeated in my own cadence but pitched down into a register no human throat owns, dragged slow like tape on dying batteries, and at the end of it a sound that I can only call amusement. The line went dead. I traced the call in the morning. It originated from the emergency phone at the Childs Glacier Recreation Site 50 miles out the road, a road that was closed, snowed in, and physically impassable to vehicles, at a phone box that sits under a shelter roof which we found when the road opened in May, deeply scored by 4 parallel gouges, as if something had gripped the edge of that roof for balance while it leaned down to the receiver. 2 months later, I put in for Skagway. I told Amy Baker it was a promotion. Amy looked at me the way mothers look at children who are lying about being brave and said, "It walked a circle around us and left a door open behind your office, and you are going to walk through a different door and call it a promotion." Then she hugged me and told me to write everything down because paper does not flinch. Amy, if you ever hear this, I wrote it down. Skagway in the shoulder season is a town of ghosts and shutters. In summer, the cruise ships pour thousands of tourists into 3 streets of Gold Rush storefronts. In October, the ships stop. The seasonal workers fly south like waterfowl, and what remains is a few hundred residents, the wind funneling down the Taya Inlet, and the mountains standing over the town like a jury. My district covered the historic corridor, the Chilkoot Trail, and the Daya Flats, where the ghost town of Daya rots quietly into the tide meadows. On paper, it was a caretaker posting. History rather than wilderness. I believed the paper for exactly 6 weeks. Sharon Mitchell disabused me. Sharon was 60, the Historical Society archivist, a precise, twinkling woman who ran the collection out of a former brothel on Broadway and knew more about the gold rush than any published book. I came to her that first autumn on a work matter, tracking down survey records for the Daya town site, and I noticed, filed in a flat drawer she opened by mistake, a folder labeled in faded pencil with 2 words, "Hairy Man." She saw me see it. She closed the drawer, studied me for a moment with those bright archivist eyes, and said, "You are the ranger who transferred from Cordova." And then she said, "You have the look," and she opened the drawer again. The folder held photocopies and transcriptions going back to 1898, Stampeder diaries, a Northwest Mounted Police duty log from the Chilkoot Summit, 2 letters from a tramway engineer to his wife in Seattle, a newspaper clipping from 1899 with the corner burned away. Different hands, different decades, one creature. The Stampers called it the tall walker of the passes. The Tlingit packers who worked the trail, Sharon told me, would not camp at 2 specific places between Canyon City and Sheep Camp, and would not say why to outsiders, and charged double to pass those places after dusk. The mounted police log, in beautiful copperplate handwriting, recorded that on the night of March 2nd, 1898, something walked through the summit camp between the tents, upright, in a blizzard, and that the constable who followed the tracks reported they continued for a quarter mile and then ended, mid-stride, in open snow, as if the walker had simply stepped out of the world. The tramway engineer wrote to his wife that the dogs of Sheep Camp all went silent at the same hour each night. And that silence, he wrote, is the mountain listening, and I read that sentence twice because I had seen 26 huskies flattened and mute outside Talkeetna, and here was a dead man describing it a century earlier, 300 miles away. Sharon watched me read. When I finally looked up, she said, "Every generation, it takes an interest in someone. The record keepers, the trail walkers, the ones who write things down." Her grandfather had been one, she said. A wharf clerk who kept a diary until 1923, when the diary stops, mid-sentence, on an entry that begins, "It was on the roof again last night," and she let the word hang exactly the way the diary does. There was one more document in Sharon's folder, and it is the one I think about most because it is the only one with a photograph attached. The 1899 newspaper clipping with the burned corner came from the Skagway Press, a single column reporting that a wharf watchman had fired both barrels of a shotgun at, and I am quoting the surviving text, "a great gaunt hound of unnatural stature which did stand upon its hind limbs at the end of the Moor Wharf, and did regard the watchman with an intelligence unbecoming a beast." The burned corner takes the rest of the account. But pinned behind the clipping was a photograph, a real albumen print, of the wharf the following morning. A dozen men in derby hats, standing in a rough circle, all of them looking down at the planks, and on the planks, visible even through a century of silver fade, a line of prints in the frost, crossing the entire length of the wharf toward the water and simply ending at the edge. Sharon let me hold it. On the back, in pencil, in a hand she identified as her own grandfather's, the wharf clerk, were 7 words. It looked at me the longest, and I stood there in that former brothel on Broadway holding a photograph older than every living person in the state, and I felt the folder in my own head slide open, Talkeetna, Cordova, and now this. and I heard Jason Adams laughing at his farewell dinner. It wants witnesses, and I understood that I was holding the work of a previous witness, and that the collection had been waiting for its next contributor, and that the drawer had not been opened by mistake at all. That winter, Gary Perez started calling the station. Gary was 47, a helicopter tour operator who flew the passes all summer and spent winters maintaining his machines and his grievances. Gary was not a fanciful man. His calls were short, irritated, and precise, which is why they frightened me. Something was following the White Pass railway line at night, he said. He had seen it twice from the highway, pacing inside the tree line parallel to the tracks. On the second occasion, he stopped the truck, and it stopped. He turned off his headlights to see it better against the snow, and in the sudden gloom he understood, he said, that turning off the lights had been its idea somehow, and he drove home at 90 miles an hour and sat in his garage until sunrise. I asked him the question I now asked every witness. How tall? He said, Ranger, I sling loads under a helicopter for a living. I judge mass and height every working day of my life. That thing goes 8 feet and I would guess 500 pounds, and it moves like it weighs nothing, and I need you to tell me you believe me, because my wife does not, and I have not slept in 9 days. I told him I believed him. I told him about the folder in Sharon's flat drawer. It was the first time in my career I had given a witness the truth instead of a form, and Gary Perez, 500 flight hours a year, a man built out of checklists, put his head down on his kitchen table and wept with relief. That is the part they never put in the monster stories. The creature takes your sleep and your certainty, but it is the silence afterward, the not being believed, that takes people apart bone by bone. Laura Roberts went up to Chilkoot on the last permitted weekend of the season, and everything that happened afterward happened fast, so I am going to slow it down for you minute by minute because I have replayed it that way every night for years. Laura was 39, a schoolteacher from Juneau, experienced, permitted, properly equipped, hiking the historic trail solo as she had done twice before. She checked in with me personally at the trail center on a Friday morning. We talked about the weather window. We talked about the bears denning late that year. As she shouldered her pack, she paused at the door and asked, almost casually, whether other hikers had mentioned the smell near Canyon City. I asked what smell. She said, like a wet dog, but huge, and she laughed at her own phrasing, and I did not laugh, and she noticed that I did not laugh, and something passed between us across that counter that I will regret until they bury me. I let her go anyway. The trail was legal. The paperwork was in order. Paper does not flinch, Amy said, but I promise you paper also does not warn. Saturday evening, 6:47 p.m., her satellite messenger sent its scheduled check-in from sheep camp. All well. Sunday morning, 4:12 a.m., the device sent an SOS. Then, 90 seconds later, before any coordinator could respond, it sent the all-clear cancellation code. Then, at 4:16 a.m., another SOS. Then another cancellation. Then nothing. The overdue protocols gave it until Monday. I did not. I was at the Dia trailhead by 6 a.m. Sunday with a headlamp and the spare radio, and I broke every solo travel rule in the manual going up that canyon in the dim, and I would break them again. The Chilkoot in late October is a corridor of frost-hung silence. The tourists are gone. The rangers are gone. The Forest Service cabins are shuttered. I made Canyon City by 9 a.m. and the smell was waiting for me there, exactly where Laura had asked about it, pooled in the low ground by the old boiler like something that had been poured. Wet dog, turned earth, and under it a sweetness like meat forgotten in a warm room. The frost on the boardwalk planks showed prints, 17 inches, 4 clawed toes, fresh enough that the frost crystals had not regrown inside them. They were heading up trail, toward sheep camp, toward her. I keyed the radio at Canyon City to report my position, and I want to put on the record what the radio did, because Gary Perez heard the town side of it and confirmed it later. Mid-transmission, my signal cut, and for 4 seconds the channel carried something else, a voice, my voice, repeating the position I had just given, word for word, in that same dragged pitch-down register from the Cordova phone box, from 50 miles of impossible road, from years and hundreds of miles away. Then the channel cleared as if nothing had happened. In town, Amy Baker, who had moved to Skagway Dispatch 2 years after I did, because some people follow their hauntings and some hauntings arrange to be followed, took off her headset, told the coordinator she needed air, walked outside, and stood in the street looking north at the mountains until her hands stopped shaking. She told me all this afterward with the flat calm of a woman done pretending. It knows the procedures, she said. It has been listening to us its whole life, or ours. I reached sheep camp at noon. Her tent stood in the designated area, and I have to stop here and tell you that when I saw it, zipped, intact, orderly, I sat down on the frozen ground about 30 feet away and could not approach it for several minutes, because I had seen this before, on a bench above Clear Creek 700 miles away and 15 years earlier. And the repetition felt less like coincidence and more like handwriting. Her sleeping bag held the shape of a person who had slid out carefully. Her satellite messenger lay on the bag, powered on, its little screen showing the cancellation menu. Her boots were gone. Neatly, beside the tent flap, her headlamp had been placed on a flat stone, switched on, pointing up trail, its beam long since drowned by daylight, but its message legible to me alone among the living. Toe of the boot in the moss. Beam of the lamp on the stone. Toward me. Follow. It was inviting me again. It had been inviting me for 15 years. I radioed the SOS coordinates back to town, and I know I should have waited for the helicopter, for the team, for Gary Perez and his sling gear and the whole apparatus of rescue. Instead, I stood up and I followed the beam, up through the boulder field toward the scales, where the stampers once weighed their goods under the eyes of the summit, and where every one of Sharon Mitchell's dead diarists had marked the second place the packers would not camp. The gloom comes early there in October. The peaks eat the afternoon. I climbed through fields of frost-split granite with my breath tearing and my sidearm out, following boot prints now, hers, small and clean, walking prints, not running, spaced calmly among the boulders, and alongside them, matching her pace exactly, printed in the skim of snow, with a stride length that made my skin move on my back, the other prints, side by side. Not pursuing her, escorting her. I found Laura Roberts at the foot of the Golden Stairs at 4:40 in the afternoon, seated on the flat stone the stampers called the weighing table, wrapped in a caribou hide that no outfitter in this state has sold in 100 years, alive, warm, her bare feet tucked beneath her, staring up at the summit with an expression I have only otherwise seen in paintings of saints. She was whispering multiplication tables. Her mind had gone somewhere orderly to survive. When I touched her shoulder, she looked at me without surprise and said, perfectly clearly, they carried the ones who fell, you know, in the avalanche year. They dug them out and carried them down, and no one ever wrote it in the books because no one would say what did the carrying. Then she looked past me, over my shoulder, up the slope, and smiled at something, and said thank you, and fainted into my arms. I did not turn around quickly. I turned the way you turn when you already know. On the ridgeline above the stairs, black against the last gray light, stood the thing I had been transferred toward 3 times in my life, upright, ears erect, utterly still, its long head angled down at us. It stood there while I got the hide around her and the harness rigged. It stood there while Gary Perez brought the helicopter screaming up the valley with the coordinator screaming in my ear. It stood there in the rotor gale that flattened every stunted spruce on the ridge, unmoved, watching its witnesses lifted into the sky. Gary saw it too. It is in his flight log, written in a shaking hand, in the remarks column where pilots write bird strikes and fuel notes. One word, confirmed. There is a coda to that day that never made any report. When the helicopter lifted with Laura secured and Gary fighting the pass winds, I remained on the weighing table for the pickup on the second cycle, alone at the scales in the failing light for 11 minutes, the longest 11 minutes of my life, and I want to tell you what the mountain did with them. The wind stopped, completely. At the scales in October, the wind does not stop. Ask any stampeder diary, ask any climber. And yet it stopped, and into that impossible stillness, from the ridge, came the knocking. 3 heavy, spaced, woody impacts, the Cordova pattern, in country above the tree line where there is no wood to strike. And from the boulder field below me, from the direction of sheep camp, from the direction I would have to descend if the helicopter failed, came the answer. 3 knocks. There were 2 of them. There had been 2 of them at minimum since Cordova, talking across valleys, and I had spent years thinking of it as a solitary intelligence when it was, at the very least, a household. I stood on that flat stone where 100,000 desperate men once weighed everything they owned, and I understood that I was being weighed, that I had been on the scale since a gravel bar on the Talkeetna River. And when the helicopter came thundering back over the ridge, the wind resumed between one heartbeat and the next, like a curtain closing on a stage when the audience has seen enough. Laura Roberts recovered, in body, within a week. The specialists found mild hypothermia, no injuries, and no explanation for how a barefoot woman survived a night at the scales in October. The caribou hide went to Sharon Mitchell's archive, where it was examined by a materials researcher from the university, who dated the tanning method to the 1890s and asked repeatedly where we had really found it, and who left Skagway on the next ferry without filing his report. Laura went back to teaching in Juneau. She sends me a card every October. She never mentions the mountain. The cards are always paintings of open water. Ryan Carter left the service and works in fisheries technology in Seattle now. He calls once a year, on the anniversary of the 12-camera night, and we talk about football for 20 minutes, and then, always, in the last minute of the call, he asks the same question. Was the 9th-foot camera facing out or facing in? Because in his last week in Cordova, cataloging equipment for transfer, he found that camera aimed not at the timber but back at the station, at the window of my office, and its memory card held one final image, time-stamped a month after we pulled the program, of the station wall at night, my window dimly lit, and my own silhouette at the desk, photographed from the timber by a camera that recorded in its metadata that it had been physically handled, repositioned, and triggered manually. I tell him every year that I do not remember which way it faced. That is the only lie left in this recording. Sharon Mitchell added the printout to the folder in the flat drawer behind the wharf photograph, one witness filed behind another, and she wrote a new label for the folder in her fine archivist pencil, and the label does not say Harry Mann anymore. It says, continuing, Ronald Green died 2 winters ago, at 91, in his cabin outside Talkeetna, in his sleep, with his door barred from the inside, and, his nephew told me at the funeral, a fresh line of huge prints in the snow that walked a slow circle around the cabin that final night, paused for a long time at the bedroom wall, and departed north. The nephew asked me what kind of bear does that. I told him no kind of bear, and he nodded, and neither of us said anything else, because we are Alaskans, and there is a shape our silence has learned to hold. I am retired now myself. I live where I can see a tree line from my kitchen window, which people tell me is strange, given everything, but they misunderstand. You do not watch the tree line out of fear. You watch it the way you watch the door at a reunion. Because here is what 15 years and 3 towns and 1 burned newspaper clipping from 1899 have taught me. And it is not the lesson I wanted. I spent my whole career believing I was investigating it, building the file, following the tracks, connecting Talkeetna to Cordova to Skagway, the cooler to the kennels, to the cameras, to the summit. I believed I was the record keeper Sharon talked about, the witness, the one who writes things down so the paper can hold what people cannot. But witnesses do not choose their cases. Cases choose their witnesses. It never followed me. Look at the map of my life the way I finally looked at it, spread on this kitchen table under this lamp. Every transfer I requested, every posting that opened at the perfect moment, every gap in every circle of tracks, and every gap was always behind my office, my window, my wall. The boot pointed north, and I went north. The headlamp pointed up trail, and I went up. Julie Nelson set aside. Laura Roberts kept warm. Both of them delivered, unharmed, into my hands, and only my hands, as if the whole apparatus of terror existed to make sure that one particular man kept arriving, kept seeing, kept writing it down. It was never leaving a trail for me to follow. It was training me, and I have to tell you what happened last night, because it is the reason I finally recorded all of this, tonight, in one sitting, with the doors locked and this microphone too close to my mouth. Last night, a little after 3 in the morning, the dogs at the neighboring property went silent. All at once, the way 26 huskies went silent outside Talkeetna a lifetime ago. I got up. I did not turn on the lights. I went to the kitchen window, and I looked at my tree line, and my tree line looked back, tall and still and patient at the edge of the yard, and I felt no fear at all. And that is the part you should be afraid of, because it did not come to be seen this time. It has done that. It has spent 15 years doing that. This time it raised one long arm, slowly, deliberately, and it did the thing I have not been able to stop thinking about for 19 hours. It pointed north, and God help me, I have already packed the truck. If anything worth telling comes back down that road, you will hear it here first. And if nothing comes back, then this recording is the last entry in the file, and the file was never mine. Sleep well tonight. Leave a light on for the record keepers. And whatever you hear circling in the timber behind your own quiet life, when it finally stands up, do not run. It never wanted us to run. It wanted us to follow. The radio crackled twice before it died completely, and that was the first sign that the night was not going to end the way I had planned it. I was sitting inside a truck with a cracked windshield, parked on the edge of a gravel road outside Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, the northernmost settlement in the United States, where the sun does not rise for nearly 2 months and the cold does not simply touch the skin, it reaches into the bone and stays there. My name does not matter yet. What matters is the report sitting open on my lap, half filled out, a form the agency required after every missing person call, and I had already written 3 names on it that week, and it was only Thursday. Before I go further, I want to ask something of you. If this story pulls you in the way it pulled me into that gravel road at 2 in the afternoon under a sky the color of a bruise, then press that subscribe button, leave a comment telling me what you would have done differently, and tap the like button so more people can find their way to these files. I write under 3 banners, Sir Belecho, Mr. Belecho, and Mr. Geronimo, and each one carries a different piece of what happened out there on the tundra. Now, back to the account. Utqiagvik does not behave like other places I have worked. In most of my postings across the lower states, gloom falls and then lifts again within a matter of hours. Here, in the depth of winter, the gloom simply stays. It becomes a resident. The people who live there build their lives around it the way sailors build lives around the tide, and most of them adjust just fine. I did not adjust. I never got the chance to. My name is Anthony Lee. I am 37 years old, and I had been a ranger for 11 years before Utqiagvik, mostly in temperate country, mostly chasing lost hikers out of pine forest and reuniting them with panicked families by nightfall. Nothing had prepared me for a landscape with no trees at all, a flat white nothing that stretched to a horizon you could not always see, broken only by ice ridges that looked, from a distance, like the spine of something enormous lying just beneath the surface, waiting. The call that started everything came in from a woman named Heather Perez, 49 years old, a school teacher who had lived in Utqiagvik for over 20 years and who did not scare easily, according to everyone who described her to me afterward. Heather called the station to report that her neighbor, a quiet man named Stephen Harris, 53, had not shown up to help her clear snow from her generator shed, which he had done every single week without fail for 6 years. She said this in a voice that was trying very hard to sound practical and only partly succeeding. I drove out with my supervisor, a man who has since left the service, and asked that his name be left out of any account of this, and we found Stephen Harris's house locked from the inside, his truck still parked with the engine block heater plugged in, his boots gone but his heavy parka still hanging on its hook by the door. No man walks into a Utqiagvik winter without his parka, not unless he did not intend to be gone long, or not unless something walked him out before he had the chance to think about what he needed. We searched his property in the gray hour that passed for daylight. Behind his shed, in a patch of snow protected from the worst of the wind, we found tracks. I want to describe them exactly as I saw them because everything that follows depends on you understanding what I understood in that moment. The tracks were shaped roughly like a canine print, the kind you would expect from a large wolf or a sled dog that had slipped its line, except for 2 details that refused to sit comfortably in my mind. The stride length between prints was nearly 6 feet, far beyond what any 4-legged animal of that print size could produce, and every 3rd or 4th print showed a strange doubling, as if for a few paces at a time whatever made the tracks had risen up onto 2 legs before dropping back down onto 4. I did not say anything about this to my supervisor. I photographed the tracks, I logged the coordinates, and I told myself that snowdrift and wind distortion could explain almost any strange shape if you looked at it long enough and wanted an explanation badly enough. I have told myself a great many things since that day, and very few of them turned out to be true. Rebecca Ramirez was the one who told me about the stories. She was 62, born in Utqiagvik, the closest thing the community had to an unofficial historian, and when I visited her small house that same evening to ask about the Harris disappearance, she poured 2 cups of tea before I had even finished explaining why I had come, as if she already knew, as if she had been waiting for someone in a ranger jacket to knock on her door for years. She told me about a shape the elders had spoken of for generations, something that walked the ice in the deepest cold, something that was not quite wolf and not quite man, and that the old word for it, when translated poorly into English by outsiders over the decades, had eventually flattened into a phrase that traveled south into other cultures and other folklore until it lost its original teeth. She did not use the word dogman. She used a word I will not attempt to spell here, because I never learned to write it correctly and I do not want to insult her memory by guessing. But when she described its behavior, the way it stalked before it struck, the way it seemed to enjoy the chase more than the kill, I understood exactly what modern folklore had renamed it. Rebecca told me one more thing before I left her house that night, something that has stayed lodged in my chest ever since. She said the shape only came for people who had stopped being careful, people who had grown too comfortable with the cold, who had begun to think of the tundra as tame simply because they had crossed it safely so many times before. She looked at me directly when she said this, and I have never been sure whether she was warning me about Stephen Harris or about myself. 3 days after Stephen Harris vanished, Mark Thompson disappeared as well. Mark Thompson was 65 years old, a retired maintenance worker who spent most of his time now doing exactly what he had done his whole life, fixing things that other people had given up on. He lived alone at the edge of town in a cabin surrounded by stacked crab pots and a rusted snowmobile he had been restoring for longer than anyone could remember. When his sister called the station to say she had not heard from him in 2 days, which was unusual even for a man who valued his solitude, I drove out myself. I found his cabin door standing wide open, snow already drifted across the threshold in a thin white tongue that reached almost to the stove. His snowmobile sat untouched in the shed. His rifle, a bolt action he kept loaded by the door out of habit rather than fear, was still in its rack, unfired, magazine full. Whatever came for Mark Thompson did not give him the chance to reach for it, or it did not consider the rifle a threat worth avoiding. Outside, the tracks were there again. The same elongated stride, the same intermittent doubling where the gait shifted from 4 points of contact to 2 and back again. This time, though, there was something new. Along the edge of the tracks, pressed into softer snow near the shed wall, I found 5 parallel gouges, each one nearly 2 inches deep, spaced the width of a wide hand. Claw marks, though I did not want to call them that yet, not out loud, not even in the privacy of my own head. I brought Andrew Clark into the search on the 4th day. Andrew was 32, a younger ranger who had transferred up from Fairbanks the same season I had, eager in the specific way that people are eager before the cold has fully taught them respect. He did not believe in Rebecca Ramirez's stories, and he said so more than once, usually with a small laugh that I think he intended to reassure himself as much as anyone listening. We tracked the prints for nearly 4 miles out onto the sea ice before losing them at a pressure ridge, a place where 2 enormous plates of ice had collided and folded upward into a jagged wall taller than either of us. Andrew wanted to keep going. I told him no. The light was already thinning, and out on the ice, in a landscape with no shelter and no landmarks, losing the light meant losing everything. It was on the walk back that we heard it for the first time. A sound that started low, almost like wind moving through a structure with a hollow inside, and then rose into something that neither of us had a ready word for. Not a wolf howl, though it shared the shape of one. There was a second layer underneath it. A rasping undertone, almost like a voice trying to shape itself around the howl and not quite succeeding. Andrew stopped walking. I stopped walking. Neither of us spoke for what felt like a very long time, though when I checked my watch afterward only 40 seconds had passed. We reported the sound to the station as likely wolf activity. I wrote it that way in the official log because I did not yet have the vocabulary or the courage to write anything else, and because I still half believed, or wanted to half believe, that a rational explanation was waiting somewhere just out of reach, patient, willing to be found if I only searched hard enough. Stephanie White changed that belief permanently. Stephanie was 40 years old, a search and rescue volunteer who had lived in the region for over a decade and who had more field experience in Arctic conditions than I did. She joined the search team on the 6th day, driving her own snowmobile out to the pressure ridge where Andrew and I had lost the trail, insisting she wanted to see the site herself before committing resources to a wider search grid. I went with her. I should have insisted she wait for full daylight, such as it was, but she was persuasive, and I was tired, and tired rangers make decisions they later regret. We reached the pressure ridge just as the gray afternoon light began collapsing into true evening. Stephanie dismounted and walked ahead of me toward the ice wall, her headlamp cutting a narrow cone through air thick with blowing snow. I heard her stop. I heard her say my name, not loudly, but in a tone that carried a specific kind of alarm, the kind that does not announce itself with volume but with control, the voice of someone trying very hard not to make a sound big enough to attract attention. I caught up to her and looked where her headlamp pointed. Standing atop the pressure ridge, perhaps 30 feet above us and 40 feet distant, was a shape I have spent every year since trying and failing to properly describe. It stood on 2 legs, though the posture was wrong for a person. The spine curved forward at an angle no human spine holds comfortably, the shoulders too wide, the arms hanging past where knees would be if it had been human. Its head was elongated, more muzzle than face, and even at that distance and in that poor light, I could see the shape of its ears standing upright, alert, turned directly toward us. Its coat, if that is the right word, was a mottled gray that nearly matched the ice behind it, which is likely the only reason we saw it at all, because it had shifted its weight at the exact moment Stephanie's headlamp swept across the ridge. We did not move. It did not move. For nearly a full minute, the three of us existed in a kind of frozen negotiation, predator and prey working out, without a single sound, who understood the terms of the encounter better. Then it dropped onto four limbs in a motion too fluid and too fast for anything with a skeleton built like that, and it was gone over the far side of the ridge before either of us could raise a weapon or a light or a word. Stephanie did not speak the entire ride back to town, neither did I. When we reached the station, she sat in her truck for nearly 20 minutes before coming inside, and when she finally did, the first thing she said was that she was done pretending this was wolves, and she wanted to know what I intended to do about it. I did not have an answer for her that night. I would have one soon, though I wish now that I never had to give it. Word travels fast in a town of 4,000 people surrounded by nothing but ice and ocean. By the following morning, most of Utqiagvik knew that a search and rescue volunteer and a park ranger had seen something on the pressure ridge, and the town split cleanly into two camps. One camp treated the sighting as confirmation of stories they had grown up hearing from grandparents and never quite dismissed. The other camp treated it as a symptom of isolation, cold, and stress, the kind of shared hallucination that sometimes takes root in small communities during the deepest part of winter, when the sun disappears and the mind starts filling gaps the eyes cannot. I called a meeting at the community center that evening, less because I had answers and more because I needed to see the faces of the people I was supposed to be protecting, and I needed them to know that I was taking Stephen Harris and Mark Thompson seriously, whatever the cause of their disappearance turned out to be. Kimberly Sanchez attended that meeting. She was 46, the closest thing the town had to a public health liaison, responsible for coordinating with regional services and outside agencies whenever something exceeded local capacity. She had already placed a call to state authorities about the two missing men, and she stood at the meeting with a clipboard and a carefully neutral expression that I came to recognize over the following days as the expression of a woman trying to hold a community together with willpower alone. Kimberly asked me directly, in front of nearly 80 people crowded into folding chairs, whether I believed a wild animal was responsible for what happened to Harris and Thompson. I told her the truth, which was that I did not know what I believed, but that the tracks we found were unlike any documented wolf or bear activity in the region, and that I intended to request additional resources from the regional office. That request was denied within 2 days. The regional office cited budget constraints and the remoteness of the posting and suggested that local law enforcement, working alongside existing ranger staff, should be sufficient to manage what they termed, in the cold language of an internal memo I was never supposed to see, a probable wildlife incident with elevated public concern. I remember reading that phrase, probable wildlife incident, and thinking of the tracks with the doubled stride, and the sound that was not quite a howl, and Rebecca Ramirez's face when she described a shape that only came for those who had stopped being careful. Rebecca herself came to see me the day after the community meeting. She did not bring tea this time. She brought a folder, worn soft at the corners from age, containing photocopies of newspaper clippings and handwritten notes that her mother and grandmother had kept over the decades, documenting every disappearance in the region that the community had quietly, privately attributed to the shape on the ice. There were 11 documented cases stretching back over 60 years, spaced unevenly, sometimes a decade apart, sometimes only a season. Every case shared certain features. The disappearances clustered in the deepest and coldest part of winter, when daylight all but vanished. The missing were almost always people who lived or worked near the edges of town, close to open tundra or sea ice, rather than in the denser center of the community. And in nearly every case, at least one witness reported hearing a howl with what they described as an unnatural, layered quality, as though something underneath the sound was trying and failing to shape words. Rebecca told me the disappearances always came in clusters of 2 or 3 before stopping abruptly for years at a time, and she believed, based on patterns her grandmother had tracked long before anyone called it a pattern, that we were only part way through the current cluster. She believed at least one more person would vanish before the shape moved on, or went dormant, or whatever it was that made these things start and stop the way they did. I asked her why the pattern always stopped rather than continuing until something intervened. She said her grandmother believed the shape hunted the way a wolf hunts, culling carefully rather than recklessly, taking only enough to sustain itself before withdrawing back into the deep ice for another interval, sometimes years, sometimes longer. She said her grandmother also believed something else, something Rebecca seemed reluctant to say out loud, and when she finally did say it, I wished she had kept it to herself a little longer. She said her grandmother believed the shape was not simply an animal that had always existed on the ice. She believed it had once been a man, generations ago, a hunter who had broken a rule so old that almost nobody alive still remembered what the rule had originally protected, and that the punishment for breaking it had reshaped him permanently, trapping something human inside a body that no longer behaved like one. She said this was why witnesses so often described the sound as almost forming words, because somewhere inside the howl, something that used to be a person was still trying to speak. I did not know what to do with that story except log it, the way I logged everything else, and carry it with me onto the ice for the rest of that terrible winter. 2 nights later, Stephen Harris's body was found. It was Andrew Clark who found him, out near the pressure ridge where Stephanie and I had seen the shape, half buried under a recent drift, in a condition I will not describe in detail here, both out of respect for his family and because some images are better left where they happened rather than repeated for entertainment. I will say only that the specialists who eventually examined the remains, flown in from a regional facility because Utqiagvik had no permanent examiner of its own, could not determine a clear cause of death, and their report used careful, clinical language that avoided committing to any specific predator, wildlife or otherwise. What I can tell you, because I stood at that site myself before the specialists arrived, is that the tracks leading to and from the body showed the same elongated stride and intermittent doubling we had documented at both previous scenes. And a short distance away, half covered by snow, we found Harris's boots placed together side by side, almost deliberately, as though something had taken the time to set them down with care before leaving the rest of him behind. I have turned that detail over in my mind more times than I can count. An animal does not arrange a dead man's boots. A predator does not pause mid-kill to tidy anything. But something that used to understand the meaning of boots, something that used to live inside a body that wore them, might still carry some faint, twisted memory of the gesture, even after everything else about it had changed beyond recognition. That was the night I stopped sleeping properly. It was also the night Kimberly Sanchez told me she believed the town needed to consider a curfew, and the night Andrew Clark, who had laughed off Rebecca's stories only a week earlier, asked me quietly if I thought we should request a transfer for both of us before the cluster, as Rebecca called it, claimed its third victim. The curfew went into effect within 48 hours of Stephen Harris's body being recovered. Kimberly Sanchez pushed it through the town council with an efficiency that surprised even her, arguing that regardless of whether the threat was animal, environmental, or something the science could not yet classify, the practical response remained identical: keep people indoors and group together after the light failed completely. Most of the town complied. A community accustomed to genuine Arctic danger does not need much convincing when a credible threat is identified, and by the second night of the curfew, the streets near the edge of town stood as empty and silent as I had ever seen them, the wind carrying nothing but loose snow across roads that would normally still hold a few passing trucks even in deep winter. Mark Thompson's family held a small vigil for him that same week, since his body had not yet been located and hope, however thin, had not entirely disappeared. Andrew Clark and I attended in our official capacity, standing near the back of a gathering that filled Rebecca Ramirez's community hall nearly to capacity. I remember watching the faces in that room and thinking that fear had already reorganized the entire town's rhythm, its habits, its sense of which hours belonged to people and which hours belonged to something else. It was during that same week that Heather Perez, the school teacher who had first reported Stephen Harris missing, came to me with an account she said she had been too frightened to share earlier. She told me that 3 nights before Harris disappeared, she had woken in the middle of the night to a sound outside her window, and when she looked out, expecting perhaps a stray sled dog, she instead saw a shape crouched at the edge of her yard, motionless, facing her window directly, as though it had already known she would wake and look. She said she did not move, did not breathe for what felt like several minutes, until the shape finally rose, turned, and walked away on 2 legs with a gait she described as wrong in a way she still could not fully articulate, before dropping onto 4 legs once it reached the tree line at the edge of her property. Though Utqiagvik has almost no trees, and what she likely meant, she corrected herself, was the line of storage sheds and equipment racks that marked the boundary of town. Heather asked me the question that had clearly been sitting in her chest for days. She asked whether I believed it had been watching her specifically, studying her habits, the way a hunter studies a route before committing to it. I told her I did not know, though privately I had begun to suspect that the shape's approach to hunting was more deliberate, more patient, than anything I had previously associated with an animal attack. It was choosing its targets with something that resembled intention. I organized a wider search grid that week, requesting volunteers from among the town's most experienced outdoorsmen and women, since the regional office had made clear no additional support was coming. Stephanie White volunteered again despite everything she had seen at the pressure ridge, and when I asked her why, given the obvious danger, she told me she would rather face the thing that took Stephen Harris with her eyes open than spend the rest of the winter locked in her house waiting for it to choose her instead. Andrew Clark, Stephanie White, and I formed the core of the search team, joined on alternating days by a rotating group of volunteers that at various points included Kimberly Sanchez, who insisted on accompanying at least one expedition despite having no formal outdoor training, and Rebecca Ramirez, who came not to search but to advise, walking the edges of our search grid and pointing out landmarks that carried old significance, places her grandmother had marked on hand-drawn maps decades earlier as locations to avoid during the coldest months. One of those locations was a shallow cave system carved into a low ridge roughly 6 miles from town, a place Rebecca said her grandmother had specifically named as a place where the shape, or its predecessors, had denned during past clusters. We approached the ridge cautiously, spread in a loose formation, headlamps cutting narrow paths through blowing snow that had begun falling harder as the afternoon light collapsed toward evening. It was Kimberly who found the entrance first, a gap in the ice-covered ridge wall barely large enough for a person to enter while crouching. The air coming from inside carried an unmistakable smell, organic and heavy, the kind of smell that does not belong to ice and stone. Andrew wanted to enter immediately. I told him no, not without proper equipment, not without daylight, and certainly not with a group this size and this poorly prepared for a confined space encounter with something we still did not fully understand. We marked the location, photographed the entrance, and began the walk back toward our vehicles, parked nearly a mile away at the nearest point a truck could reach. We had covered perhaps half that distance when the howl came again, closer than either previous time, close enough that I felt it as much as heard it. A vibration moving through the frozen ground and up through the soles of my boots. This time, the layered undertone Andrew and I had noticed weeks earlier was unmistakable to everyone in the group. Kimberly said afterward that for one impossible moment she believed she had heard, buried somewhere inside that terrible sound, a fragment of a word, though she could not say what word, only that it had chilled her more deeply than the cold itself. We reached the trucks without incident. But when Stephanie did a final head count before we pulled away, she realized Rebecca Ramirez was not among us. We found Rebecca standing alone, roughly 100 yards behind our group, near the edge of a low ridge, facing away from us, entirely still. Her headlamp pointed down at the snow rather than ahead of her. Andrew called her name. She did not respond. My chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. When we reached her, she turned toward us slowly, and I saw immediately that she was unharmed, though her expression carried something I had not seen on her before, a kind of stunned recognition, as though she had just confirmed a belief she had carried her entire life and found the confirmation far heavier than the belief itself had ever been. She told us, once we got her back into a truck and the heater running, that she had fallen slightly behind the group while examining an old marker stone her grandmother had once described, and that when she looked up, the shape had been standing less than 30 feet away on the ridge above her, watching exactly as it had watched Stephanie and me weeks earlier. But this time, Rebecca said, it had done something none of the historical accounts described. It had lowered its head slightly, in a motion she could only compare to a kind of acknowledgement, almost a nod, before turning and moving away without pursuing her at all. She believed, though she admitted she could not fully explain why, that it had recognized her, or recognized something about her connection to the old stories, and had chosen, for reasons she could not guess, to let her go. I did not know what to make of that account, and I still do not, fully. But 2 nights later, Andrew Clark did not answer his radio during a routine check-in, and when I drove to his quarters, I found the door unlocked, his cold weather gear gone, and a single set of tracks leading away from the building, out past the edge of town, toward the ridge where we had found the cave entrance. I will not pretend I made a wise decision in what happened next. I took my truck as far as the terrain allowed, then continued on foot, alone, against every protocol the agency had ever trained into me. Because Andrew Clark was 32 years old and had transferred north the same season I had, and because I could not sit in a warm office filling out a missing persons report while whatever daylight remained burned away above a landscape that had already taken 2 men and was clearly not finished, I followed his tracks for nearly 3 miles before I heard him. Not the howl this time, but his voice, distant, calling my name in a tone that carried more confusion than fear, as though he had woken somewhere unfamiliar and was still trying to orient himself. I followed the sound toward the ridge, toward the cave entrance we had marked days earlier, and as I approached, my headlamp caught movement at the mouth of the cave, low to the ground, four-limbed, moving with a speed that no injured or exhausted animal should have possessed. It rose onto two legs as it turned toward me, and for the first time I saw it clearly, fully, without blowing snow or distance to soften the details. Its face held a terrible, unfinished quality. Features caught between two states, as though something had begun the process of becoming human again and had been interrupted partway through, leaving behind an expression that was almost unbearably, almost recognizable. I did not run. I want to be honest about that, because in every account of a moment like this, people expect either heroism or panic, and I experienced neither. I simply stood there, frozen by something deeper than cold, while it studied me the way Rebecca had described it studying her, head lowered slightly, and for 3 or 4 seconds that stretched impossibly long in my memory, I believed I was about to die exactly where I stood. Then, from somewhere inside the cave, I heard Andrew's voice again, weaker now, and the shape's attention shifted away from me entirely, toward the sound, and it turned and vanished into the cave mouth in a single fluid motion. I do not remember deciding to follow it. I remember only that I was suddenly moving forward, flashlight raised, service weapon drawn, though I knew, on some level, that the weapon would matter very little against something that had already shrugged off a locked door and a full-grown man's instinct to fight. The cave narrowed quickly, forcing me into a crouch, then nearly a crawl. The walls close enough on either side that my shoulders brushed ice with every movement. The smell grew stronger the deeper I went, organic and thick, mixed now with something colder and more mineral. The smell of very old stone that had never once been touched by open air. I found Andrew roughly 60 feet in a wider chamber where the ceiling opened enough for me to stand fully upright. He was alive, curled against the chamber wall, conscious but disoriented. A wound along his shoulder that looked more like a graze than a true attack, as though something had marked him rather than tried in earnest to kill him. He looked at me and said my name, and then he said something else. Something that has stayed with me every day since. He said it had not chased him there. He said he had followed it, willingly, drawn by the same layered howl that had chilled the rest of us, because somewhere underneath the animal sound he had heard, or believed he heard, his own name spoken in a voice that felt achingly, impossibly familiar, though he could not place whose voice it was or why it would know him at all. I did not have time to process what that meant before the shape returned. It filled the chamber entrance almost completely, blocking the only path back out. And in that enclosed space, lit only by our 2 failing headlamps, I finally understood what Rebecca's grandmother's stories had been trying, imperfectly, to describe. It was not simply an animal. Its eyes, when the light caught them directly, held a depth and a focus that no true predator's eyes ever hold, an awareness that seemed to weigh us, consider us, in a way that felt almost like grief. I raised my weapon. I do not fully remember firing it, though Andrew has since confirmed that I did, twice, and that at least one shot struck the creature along its shoulder without producing any visible effect beyond a brief, low sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a cry, but something caught painfully between the two. It did not retaliate. It did not press forward and finish what it could easily have finished in that narrow, enclosed space, with 2 men trapped and no possible escape route. Instead, it withdrew slightly, lowering its head in that same strange gesture Rebecca had described, before turning and forcing its way past us along the chamber wall, close enough that I felt the heat and the impossible mass of it brush against my shoulder, and disappearing into a narrower passage at the rear of the chamber that our lights could not fully penetrate. We did not wait to see if it would return. I pulled Andrew to his feet, and we made our way back out through the passage we had entered by, moving as quickly as his injury and the cramped space allowed, until we finally emerged onto open ice under a sky just beginning, faintly, to hold the barest suggestion of returning light. Andrew survived. His wound healed cleanly, though he transferred out of Utqiagvik before the following winter began, and I have not spoken to him in several years. Not because of any falling out between us, but because I think neither of us wanted to be the one to bring the subject back up. Mark Thompson's body was never recovered. The cluster, as Rebecca called it, ended that season, exactly as her grandmother's records predicted, with no further disappearances for the remainder of my time there. I requested a transfer myself the following spring, and it was granted without much resistance, since the agency had already grown uncomfortable with how much attention Utqiagvik's incident reports had attracted from outside the region. Before I left, I visited Rebecca one final time. She gave me her grandmother's folder, the one with 60 years of documented clusters, and told me to keep it somewhere safe, because she believed, with a certainty I have never fully shaken, that the shape would return again someday, and that whoever wore the ranger jacket when it did would need to already understand what they were facing. I still have that folder. I have added 3 pages of my own to it since, and some nights, particularly in the depth of winter when the wind moves a certain way against my window, I find myself wondering whether somewhere far to the north, on ice that never truly warms, something that used to be a man is still standing at the edge of a ridge, watching, waiting for the next cluster to begin, still trying, in a voice none of us can fully understand, to remember how to speak. There is a sound a body makes when it is dragged across sea ice, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to forget it. It is not a scream. The screaming had already stopped by then. It is a soft, patient, scraping sound, the sound of dead weight moving in a straight line toward the water, and once you have heard it, you cannot unhear it. I heard it on the 16th of December, at the edge of Kotzebue Sound, under a sky that had not shown the sun in 3 weeks. I want you to understand that I am not a man who frightens easily. I have pulled drowned hunters out of the Kobuk. I have found people who wandered off into the tundra and sat down and simply stopped. None of that prepared me for what came out of the long night that winter. If you are the kind of person who likes to sit in a warm room and let a story crawl up your spine, then stay with me. And before we go any further, please subscribe to Sar Bellacio, and to Mr. Bellacio, and to Mr. Geronimo, so you never miss what I share here. Leave a like if this pulls you in, and tell me down in the comments whether you would have stayed on that ice as long as I did. I have asked myself that question 1,000 times. I still do not have an answer. My name does not matter as much as the place does, so let me give you the place. Kotzebue sits above the Arctic Circle in the far northwest of Alaska, on a narrow spit of land that pushes out into the sound like a finger testing cold water. In summer, the tundra goes green and soft, and the light never leaves. In winter, the light never comes. For roughly a month around the solstice, the sun does not lift over the horizon at all, and what you get instead is a long blue smear at noon that lasts an hour and then surrenders. I worked as a ranger out of a field station that covered the country between the town and the 2 great parks to the east, the valley of the Great Sand Dunes and the long coast of the Cape. My job was to know that land the way you know the inside of your own house in the black, by feel, by memory, by the small sounds it makes when something is wrong. That December, the land was telling me something was wrong. It started with the dogs. Kotzebue is a town that still runs on dogs in some quarters, and the teams that winter there are tough, level-headed animals bred for cold and distance. In the second week of the month, they began to refuse the ice. A musher named Christopher Anderson, 44 years old and not a man given to fancy, came into the station and set his mug down on my desk and told me his lead dog had lain down in the harness 2 miles out and would not rise. Not sick, not hurt, just staring back the way they had come, ears flat, the whole team gone rigid behind her. Christopher had run that route for 20 years. He said the dogs had never done that. He said it the way a man says a thing he does not want to be true. I told him animals get spooked. I told him the ice was making noise that year, groaning and cracking the way it does when the cold deepens fast, and that the dogs were reading the sound. He looked at me for a while. Then he said, and I remember this exactly, that the dogs were not afraid of the ice. They were afraid of something on the ice. And he left. The next report came from Amanda Lopez, 55, who ran dispatch out of the town and had done so for as long as anyone could remember. Amanda had a voice on the radio that could calm a man having the worst night of his life, and she did not waste it on nonsense. She called me at the station a little after 4 in the afternoon, when the last blue light was already draining out of the noon sky, and she said we had a hunter overdue. Richard Hernandez, 39, out on the flats past the airport chasing a ptarmigan flock, expected back by 2, no radio contact since noon. His wife had called it in. Amanda had already raised the troopers. She wanted a ranger who knew the flats. I knew the flats. I gassed the snow machine and pulled on the layers that stand between a man and death out there, and I went. The cold that afternoon was somewhere below 30 below without the wind, and the wind was not being kind. The land past the airport is flat and pale and featureless, a plain of wind-packed snow that runs out to the frozen edge of the sound with almost nothing to break it. In daylight you can see for miles. In the long night you can see the length of your headlamp and no farther, and the beam gives you back a world the size of a small room that travels with you and shows you nothing you did not already fear. I found Richard Hernandez's snow machine first. It sat idling, which was strange, its single light burning a cone into the blowing snow. His rifle lay across the seat. His pack was still strapped to the rack. A man does not leave a running machine and a good rifle out there. A man who leaves those things is a man who left in a hurry, on foot. And a man on foot in that country in that cold has minutes, not hours. I killed my engine to listen. The wind, the tick of Richard's cooling exhaust. And under those, far out toward the ice, that other sound. The soft, patient, scraping sound. I did not know yet what it was. I told myself it was ice heaving. I told myself a great many things that winter, and none of them were true. I followed his tracks. They ran out from the machine in long, panicked strides, the prints deep and far apart, a man running for his life across open snow toward the one direction that offered no shelter at all, out onto the sound. And beside his tracks, keeping pace, ran another set. I want to be careful here because I have had a long time to think about what I saw, and I do not want to make it more than it was, but I also will not make it less. The second set of tracks was not human, and it was not any animal I could name. The prints were long, longer than my spread hand, and they showed 4 toes and the deep punch of claws, the way a large canine track shows. That much would have been a wolf, and wolves range that country. But wolves run on 4 feet, and these tracks ran on 2. There were no 4 prints, just the 2 long hind tracks, one after the other, striding upright beside a running man, matching him step for terrible step, and the stride was longer than mine. I stood over those tracks with my light, and I felt the cold go into me in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. I did not follow them out onto the ice that night. I have made my peace with that, mostly. I called it in to Amanda instead, and I told her to hold the troopers back until first blue light, that I had a debris field and hazardous ice and a lost man, and that going out onto the sound in the black after a runner was a good way to lose a rescuer too. All of that was true. It was also true that I was afraid, and that the fear had a shape, and that the shape was standing somewhere out past the reach of my headlamp watching me decide. Richard Hernandez was not found that night. He was not found the next day either. On the 3rd day, a piece of his coat came in on the ice with the tide, snagged on a pressure ridge a mile from where his machine had sat idling. There was blood on it, frozen brown, and there was something else, and I will get to the something else. But I am getting ahead of myself, and this is a story that must be told in order, because the order is the only thing that makes the ending bearable. The troopers sent a man up from the regional post, a state trooper named Daniel Taylor, 50 years old, calm and square and thorough. The kind of officer who writes everything down and believes what he can measure. I liked him at once, and I have thought since that he was exactly the wrong man for what was coming, because what was coming could not be measured, and Daniel needed the world to stay inside its lines. We stood together over Richard's abandoned machine on the morning of the 17th, in the hour of thin blue light, and I showed him the tracks. By then the wind had softened the human prints, but the other set had frozen hard the first night and held. Daniel crouched over them for a long time. He put a pen down beside one for scale and photographed it. He measured the stride with a tape from his kit. When he stood up, he did not say anything for a while. Then he said, in the careful voice of a man building a wall against a thing he does not want to let in, that it was probably a bear, a brown bear, up out of a poor den, walking upright the way they sometimes do. I told him bears do not den on the sea ice and do not walk upright for 100 yards in a straight line beside a running man. I told him bears leave footprints. He knew all of that. He was a bush trooper. He had simply reached the edge of the world he could accept, and the bear was where he stood. We searched the flats and the near ice all through the short day. We found nothing more of Richard, but we found where the 2 sets of tracks ended, out on the sound, at the black lip of an open lead where the ice had cracked and the sea showed through, and the human tracks went to the edge and did not come back, and the other tracks turned there and walked away unhurried, back toward the land, back toward the town. That evening the fear I had been carrying alone became something more than mine. There is a woman in Kotzebue named Nicole Martin, 58, who runs the little store out on the edge of the old town site and has run it since before I came north. Nicole is in Upiak, and she carries the memory of that country the way some people carry a book they have read so many times they no longer need to open it. When word went around that a hunter had gone out onto the ice and a strange track had come back off it, Nicole closed her store early, which she never did, and she walked to the station in the black with a thermos of tea, and she sat down across from me and Daniel, and she asked me to describe exactly what I had seen. So I described it: the 2-legged stride, the 4-toed clawed print, the long legs, the way it had run upright beside a man and then walked away calm. Nicole listened without moving. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she told us a name, an old name, in her own language, and she said that the elders had a word for a thing that was part dog and part man, that walked on two legs and hunted people in the black months, and that came up out of the sea ice in the years when the sun stayed gone too long. She said the old people did not speak of it to be frightening. They spoke of it the way you speak of thin ice or a bad current, as a thing to be respected and avoided. She said her grandmother had told her that when the dogs will not go out onto the ice, you do not go out onto the ice either. Daniel Taylor listened to all of this with his hands folded and his face still, and I could see him filing it away under the heading of local color, of story, of the things people say in a hard land in a hard season. He was not unkind about it, he simply could not let it in. He thanked Nicole for the tea, and he said we would run the search by the book, with grids and lights and men, and that we would find whatever had done this, and it would turn out to be an animal or a person, because it was always one or the other. I walked Nicole home through the black that night. The two of us, and one headlamp and the sound of the cold ticking in the wires overhead. Halfway to her store she stopped and stood very still, and I stopped with her, and I asked her what was wrong. She did not answer at first. She just looked out past the last house toward the flats, toward the place where the town ended and the country began, and after a while she told me that when she was a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, there had been a winter like this one, a winter when the sun stayed gone too long, and a man had disappeared off the ice, and then another, and the old people had shut the village up tight and burned lamps in every window until the light came back. She said she had asked her grandmother what they were afraid of, and her grandmother had put a hand over her mouth, the way you do to a child who is about to say a name that should not be said, and had told her only that some things hear you when you speak of them, and come closer. She looked at me then, and she took her hand away from her own mouth, slowly, as if she had only just realized it was there. And she said that we had been speaking of it all evening, in the station, out loud, by the description of its tracks and its stride, and that she did not know if that mattered, if the old rule was true, but that if it was true, then it already knew we knew, and it was already closer than it had been that morning. Then she said good night, and she went inside, and I heard her turn the lock, and I stood in the black street a moment longer than I should have, listening, before I went back to the station and did not sleep. Nicole looked at him, and then she looked at me, and she said one more thing before she left. She said the old name meant, more or less, the thing that walks out of the long night. And she said that it did not stop with one. She was right. The second one to go was a woman named Lauren Thomas, 61, a wildlife specialist who had come north 2 seasons before to study the caribou herds and had stayed because the country got into her the way it does. Lauren kept a string of remote cameras out on the tundra to count animals through the winter. On the 19th, she drove her machine out to service a camera on the flats about 4 miles from town, and she did not come back, and this time there was no wife to call it in until it was very late, because Lauren lived alone and answered to no one but the caribou. We found her machine the next morning, same as Richard's, sitting where she had left it, and this time there were no tracks running away, because the wind had come up in the night and taken everything. But the camera she had gone to service was still bolted to its post, and its memory was intact, and Daniel Taylor pulled the little card, and we brought it back to the station, and we put it into a laptop, and that was the first time I saw the thing that walked out of the long night with my own eyes, in the gray and grainy light of an infrared lens, and after that I never again told myself it was a bear. The camera took a still image every 30 seconds. It had no sound. It saw in the near infrared, so the world it gave back was a flat silver country under a black sky. The snow bright, the shadows deep, the whole thing silent and slow. One frozen moment after another with half a minute of nothing between them. For a long time the images showed only the empty flats. Then, at the timestamp that would have been the middle of the afternoon, when the blue light was already gone, Lauren Thomas appeared in the frame, small and bent, working at the post with the camera above her. Frame after frame she worked, unaware she was being photographed by her own lens, and in one frame she was alone, and in the next frame, 30 seconds later, she was not. It stood at the edge of the image, at the very limit of what the lens could catch, and it was tall. That was the first thing. It was far taller than Lauren, and Lauren was not a small woman. It stood upright on 2 long legs that bent the wrong way, the way a dog's hind legs bend, and it was covered in what the infrared read as pale fur, and its arms hung too long, and its head was the head of a great dog, long-jawed, upright, ears high, turned toward the woman who did not yet know it was there. In the next frame, Lauren had turned. You could see it in the set of her body, the sudden stillness of a person who has heard something behind her in a place where there should be nothing. In the next frame, she was running, and it was already halfway to her, and its stride ate the ground between them in a way that no living thing that size should move. In the next frame, the snow was empty except for a dark smear that had not been there before. And in the frame after that, 30 seconds later, it was standing in the exact center of the image, facing the camera, facing the lens. It knew the camera was there. Its long dog's head was tipped toward it, and its eyes came back off the infrared as two blank white coins, and it was looking directly into the machine that was looking at it, and it stayed there, facing us, for the next 4 frames, 2 full minutes, not moving, while somewhere out of the frame Lauren Thomas was already gone. Daniel Taylor watched all of this without a word. When it was over, he sat back in his chair and he was pale, and his hands, which never moved, were flat on the table, pressing down as if to keep the table from lifting off the floor. He did not say bear. He did not say anything for a long while. Then he said, very quietly, that we needed to bring everyone in from the country, every camp, every hunter, every remote cabin, and we needed to do it before the next long night fell. But you cannot bring in a whole country in one short blue hour. And the thing that walked out of the long night was faster than we were. Over the next several days, the town closed in on itself the way a hand closes into a fist. Amanda Lopez ran the radio around the clock, calling out to every camp and cabin, taking the count, keeping the roster of who was in and who was still out. A young medic named Rachel Moore, 35, who ran the small clinic in town, set up a board with every name on it and moved people from one column to another as they came in, out of the country and into the light. Christopher Anderson, the musher who had told me at the very start that the dogs were afraid of something on the ice, took his best team out under armed escort to run the near cabins and pull people home, because his dogs, terrified as they were, still knew the country better than any machine. And I went out again and again into the short blue hours to bring people in because it was my country and my job, and because I had stood over those first tracks and turned back, and a part of me needed to make that right. We got most of them. I want you to know that. Most of the people out in that country that December came home, but not all of them. And the ones we lost in ways that I still cannot fit into the shape of the ordinary world. There was one run I made that I have never told anyone about in full, and I will tell it now, because it taught me the shape of the thing before I understood I was being taught. There was an old couple wintering in a cabin on the far side of the flats, and I went out for them alone in the last blue hour of the 22nd, because Christopher and his dogs were east and there was no one else. I reached the cabin as the blue was going out of the sky, and they were fine, frightened but fine, and I loaded them onto the sled behind my machine and started the run home. We were maybe 2 miles out, in the full black, my headlamp giving me back that small traveling room of light, when I saw it pacing us. It ran off to the left, out at the very edge of the beam, keeping perfect pace with the machine, and it ran upright, and it was tall, and every time I swung the light toward it, it was not there. And every time I swung the light back to the trail ahead, it was pacing us again in the corner of my eye. It did not close. It did not have to. It simply ran alongside us in the black, easy and patient for the better part of a mile, letting me know it was there, letting me feel it. And the old woman on the sled behind me had her face pressed into her husband's coat and would not look. And the old man looked at nothing at all. And I drove that machine faster than I have ever driven anything in my life. When the first lights of the town came up over the flats, the thing fell away. All at once, the way a shadow falls away when you step into a lit room, and it was simply gone. But I had felt it decide not to take us. I had felt it choose, and that was worse, in a way, than if it had come, because it meant the thing was not desperate and not driven. It was patient. It took what it wanted when it wanted, and it had wanted, that night, only to let me know it could. There was a man named Matthew Jackson, 42, a hunter and a good one, who would not come in. Matthew did not believe in the thing on the camera. He thought it was a hoax, a trick of the lens, a story the town had talked itself into during the long night, the way isolated places do. He had a cabin out past the flats and a smokehouse full of the winter's meat, and he was not going to abandon it because of a grainy picture. He told me so to my face, in the station, with his jaw set. I could not order him in. All I could do was ask him to keep his radio on and to call Amanda every hour on the hour through the black. He called every hour on the hour for 2 nights. On the 3rd night he missed the midnight call, and Amanda raised him and he came back on, and his voice was wrong. He said there was something walking around the cabin. He said it had been walking around the cabin for an hour, out at the edge of the light, going around and around in a slow circle, and that the dogs he kept had gone silent. All of them, not barking, just pressed against the door whining. He said whenever he shone his light out into the black, the walking stopped, and whenever he brought the light back in, the walking started again, always just past where he could see. Amanda kept him talking. She was very good at that. She told him help was coming, and I was already on the machine and moving, but Matthew's cabin was 40 minutes out, even running hard. At the 20-minute mark, Matthew's voice dropped to a whisper. He said it was at the window now. He said it was tall, and it was looking in, and its breath was fogging the glass, and its eyes were the palest thing he had ever seen. Amanda told him to get down, to get away from the window, to get to the back room. There was a long silence. Then Matthew Jackson said, in a voice with no fear left in it at all, only a kind of terrible wonder, that it was smiling at him, that a dog cannot smile. But this thing was smiling, and it knew his name, because it had said his name, out there in the black on the far side of the glass, in a voice that was almost his own. Then the radio went to noise, and it stayed noise. And when I reached the cabin at the top of the hour, the door was open and the dogs were gone and the meat was gone from the smokehouse and Matthew Jackson was gone, and there were long two-legged tracks in the snow going around and around the cabin in a slow circle, exactly as he had said, around and around, and then one line of them walking away, unhurried, back toward the ice. After Matthew, Daniel Taylor changed. The careful trooper who needed the world to stay inside its lines had watched those lines dissolve one by one, and something in him let go of the bear and the hoax and the reasonable explanations, and what was underneath was a harder and more useful man. He stopped trying to explain the thing and started trying to fight it. I have thought since that this was both the bravest and the most dangerous choice any of us made. We gathered in the clinic, the ones who were left carrying the weight of it. Me, Daniel. Amanda off the radio for the first time in days, gray-faced with no sleep. Rachel Moore with her board of names, more of them in the safe column now than the lost one, but the lost column no longer empty. Christopher Anderson, who had not slept either, whose hands shook not from fear but from days of running dogs through the black to bring strangers home. And Nicole Martin, who had come to sit with us again because she was the only one who had understood from the start what we were dealing with, and she knew we would need her now. Daniel spread a map on the clinic table and he asked Nicole to tell him everything the old people knew about the thing. Not the story of it, the habits of it, where it came from, where it went, what it wanted, how it could be stopped. He asked it the way a hunter asks about an animal he means to kill. Nicole told him what she knew, and it was not much, and none of it was comforting. She said the thing came up out of the sea ice in the years when the sun stayed gone too long, and that it went back down when the light returned, and that no one had ever known where it went in between. She said it hunted people, not for meat, though it took the meat, but for something else, something the old people had a word for that did not translate, a word that meant closer to loneliness than to hunger. She said it took people one at a time, and it took its time, circling, learning them, calling them by name in their own voices, because the worst thing it could do to a person out there in the black was to make them believe that something out in the black knew them and was waiting for them and would not leave until they came out. She said the old people had only one defense against it, and it was not a weapon. It was the light and the company of others. The thing hunted the ones who were alone in the black. It circled the edges of the light and it called to the ones who were separate, and the only people who survived it were the ones who stayed together, under a real light, and did not answer when it called their name. Daniel listened to all of this, and I could see him fitting it against the facts we had. Richard Hernandez, alone on the flats. Lauren Thomas, alone at her camera. Matthew Jackson, alone in his cabin, who had answered when it said his name. Every one of them taken in the black, taken alone. He looked up and he said that the sun would return in 9 days. The long night was ending. If Nicole was right, we had 9 days to keep everyone together and lit and inside, and then the thing would go back down into the ice and we would have survived it. 9 days. It did not sound like much until you have tried to keep a frightened town together through 9 nights that are one continuous night, with a thing walking around the edge of the light, calling people by name. We tried. We brought the town in tight. We ran the generators and kept the streets lit, and we told everyone the rule, the only rule, the one Nicole had given us. Stay together, stay in the light, do not go out alone into the black, do not answer if it calls your name. For 4 nights it worked. For 4 nights the thing circled the edge of the light and we heard it, we all heard it. Out past the last street lamp, a long, low sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a voice, and sometimes in that sound there were words, and sometimes the words were names, and the hardest thing I have ever done in my life was to stand in a lit street and hear that thing say the name of a person standing next to me in a voice that was almost theirs, and to put my hand on their arm and say nothing, and to watch them not answer, and to feel them shake. I want to describe those nights properly, because a person who has not lived through them cannot know what they cost. We gathered the town into the few largest buildings, the school and the clinic and the church, and we kept them full and warm and lit, and we posted watches at every door. No one slept much. You cannot sleep with that sound outside. It went on for hours, patient and unhurried, circling, and it never repeated a voice, and I came to understand that every voice it used had belonged to a real person, someone lost off that ice in some winter past, and that the thing had gathered them the way a man gathers tools, and kept them, and used them now against us one by one. There is a particular horror in hearing a dead stranger's grief in the voice of your own lost child, and there is no way to prepare a person for it, and all we could do was hold each other and count the hours until the thin blue noon. By the fourth night the town was fraying. People had stopped speaking above a whisper. Children would not sleep. An old man had to be watched every hour because he kept drifting toward the doors, drawn by a voice only he could name. Rachel Moore went from building to building through the black, checking on the frightened and the old, and I went with her when I could. And Daniel Taylor did not sleep at all. And Christopher Anderson kept his dogs chained in a lit shed and sat with them because they would not settle otherwise. We were holding. We were barely holding. But we were holding, and the sun was 5 nights away, and then it was 4. And I began, against all my better judgment, to let myself believe that we might get every last one of us through to the light. On the 5th night it called for Rachel Moore. Rachel Moore was 35 years old, and she had spent that whole long night keeping other people alive, moving from house to house, sitting with the frightened, holding the hands of the old, changing the bandages of the man Christopher's dogs had bitten in their terror. She was the one who kept the board of names. She was the one who had watched the lost column grow and had refused to let it grow any further if she could help it. And on the 5th night, in the small hours, when the streets were quiet and the cold had driven even the fear indoors, the thing came to the edge of the light, and it called her name. But it did not call it in a stranger's voice. It called it in the voice of her brother, who had died 2 winters before, out on that same ice, in a snow machine that went through a lead in the black. Rachel had never spoken of it much, but Nicole knew, the way Nicole knew everything, and Nicole had warned us that the thing did not choose its voices at random. It reached into the loneliest place in a person, and it spoke from there. I was in the clinic when it happened. I heard Rachel make a sound I have never heard a person make, a sound like something tearing loose inside her, and I turned and she was already at the door, already reaching for the handle, her face wet, her mouth shaping her brother's name, and out past the last light the voice called again. Patient and loving and exactly her brother's, telling her he was cold, telling her he had been out there so long, telling her to come and help him the way she helped everyone, to come out into the black just for a moment, just to the edge of the light, just far enough to bring him in. I got to her before she got the door open. So did Daniel. It took both of us to hold her, and she fought us. She fought us with everything she had, because she did not believe she was being hunted. She believed she was being called. She believed her brother was out there in the cold, and that we were keeping her from him. And the cruelty of that, the pure engineered cruelty of it, is a thing I will carry to my grave. We held her through the night. Amanda sat with her and talked to her the way she talked to men having the worst night of their lives, low and steady and endless. And slowly, as the voice outside kept calling and Rachel kept not being allowed to answer, the thing's spell wore thin, and Rachel came back to herself, and understood, and wept in a different way, and lived. But it had learned something that night. It had learned that we knew. It had circled the light for 4 nights, and found no one alone. And on the 5th it had reached into the safest of us, the healer, the one who kept the names, and it had almost pulled her out, and when it failed it went quiet, and the quiet was worse than the calling. For 2 nights it did not come at all. And on the 3rd night of quiet, on the 8th night, one short day before the sun was due to break the horizon and end the long night for good, the generators failed. I do not believe it was chance. I have never believed it was chance. The main generator that lit the center of town went down a little after midnight, and when Christopher Anderson and I went out to it in the black, we found the fuel line cut clean, and the tracks around the generator were the long two-legged tracks, and I understood then that the thing had been watching us longer than we had been watching it, and that it had learned not only our rule but the machine our rule depended on, and it had waited for the last long night to take the light away. The town went black, not the soft blue black of the noon hour, the true black of the deep Arctic winter night, a black with no bottom to it, and into that black the thing came at last all the way in, no longer circling the edge, because there was no edge anymore, and it began to call names, many names, from every direction at once, in every voice it had gathered out on that ice through all the years, and the town that had held together for 8 nights began, in the black, to come apart. I will not tell you everything that happened in the black that night, because some of it I did not see, and some of it I do not have the words for. But I will tell you that Amanda Lopez, who had talked 100 frightened people back from the edge across a lifetime of long nights, went out into it, not because it called her, because someone else answered. An old man 3 houses down who had lost his wife that autumn and heard her voice out in the black, and Amanda heard him go, heard his door open, and she went out after him with a lantern and her steady voice to bring him back. And that was Amanda. That was exactly who she had always been. She got him. I need you to know that. She reached the old man at the very edge of the last light, and she turned him around and she started him back toward the houses, and he made it inside, he lived. But when the door closed behind him and we counted heads in the flickering light of the lanterns we had left, Amanda Lopez was not among us. And out in the black, growing fainter, going away toward the ice, we heard the thing that walks out of the long night calling one last name in Amanda's own steady voice, calling it gently, the way she had called so many others, calling us to come and help her, and every one of us stood in that dying light with our hands over our mouths and did not go. The sun came back on the 9th day. I do not mean it rose. It did not rise, not that day, not fully. But at the noon hour the blue light was a shade less blue, and along the southern horizon for a few minutes there was a thin rind of gold, the first direct light in over a month, the edge of the returning sun brushing the underside of the sky before it slid away again. And in that thin gold light, standing at the edge of the town where the last street lamp had failed, we saw the tracks go down. They led out from the black heart of the town, the long two-legged tracks, unhurried as they had always been, out across the flats and onto the sea ice, straight and patient, toward a black lead where the sea showed through. And at the lip of that lead the tracks stopped, and they did not come back, and the returning sun touched the ice, and the thing that walked out of the long night went back down into it, back into whatever place it goes when the light returns, to wait. We never found Amanda Lopez. We never found Richard Hernandez, or Lauren Thomas, or Matthew Jackson. The sea does not give back what it takes up there, and neither does the thing that lives beneath the sea ice. We held a service for them in the spring, when the light was long and the tundra was green, and it was almost possible to believe the long night had been a fever we had all shared. Almost. Daniel Taylor left the country that summer. He was a good trooper and he could not stay. He told me before he went that he had spent his whole life believing the world stayed inside its lines and that he could go on doing his job anywhere, but not there, not in the place where he had watched the lines dissolve. I understood. I did not blame him. Rachel Moore stayed. She still keeps the clinic. She does not speak of the night the thing called her in her brother's voice, but I have seen her stand in the doorway sometimes in the deep of winter, looking out at the black, and I know what she is listening for. Christopher Anderson still runs his dogs, and his dogs still refuse the ice some nights, and when they do, he does not go out, and neither do I. And neither should you. Nicole Martin closed her store that next winter and moved south to be with her daughter. But before she went, she came to the station one last time, and she sat across from me the way she had at the start, and she told me the last thing the old people knew, the thing she had not told us before, because she had hoped we would not need it. She said the thing that walks out of the long night is patient. She said it counts the years. She said it does not need to take many, because it is not truly hunger that drives it, but that other thing, the word that means closer to loneliness, and that a thing that lonely has all the time in the world. She said the old people believed it remembers the ones who got away, that it learns them, that it waits, sometimes for years, for a night long enough, and a light thin enough, and a person alone enough, and then it calls, in a voice it has been saving, a voice it took from someone that person loved. And she looked at me across the desk, in the long summer light that never ends, and she asked me if I had heard my own name out on the ice that last black night, in the confusion, in the many voices calling from every direction at once, and I told her the truth, which is that I had heard my name called out of the black in a voice I knew, a voice I had not heard in many years, a voice I had loved and lost long before I ever came north, and I had not answered. That night, I had not answered. But the long night comes every winter up here. The sun goes down in the deep of December and it does not come back for weeks, and the black settles over the country with no bottom to it, and somewhere out under the sea ice, a patient thing counts the years and remembers the ones who got away. I am still here. I still work this country, and every winter when the light drains out of the noon sky and the long night settles in, I keep my lamps burning and I stay among people and I do not go out alone into the black, because I know it remembers me. I know it is saving a voice for me, out there under the ice, a voice I would give anything to hear again. And I know that one of these long nights, when the light is thin enough and I am tired enough and alone enough, it is going to call me by my name in that voice, and it is going to sound so much like coming home. The hardest thing is not the fear. I have made my peace with the fear. The hardest thing is that some nights, God help me, I want to answer. So keep your lights on this winter. Stay close to the ones you love. And if you are ever out in the black in a hard cold place and you hear a voice you know calling your name from somewhere just past the edge of the light, telling you it is cold, telling you it has been waiting so long, telling you to come out, just for a moment, just to the edge, do not answer. Do not answer. Do not ever answer. The last thing William Rodriguez ever said to me was that a dog will not look you in the eye unless it wants something. He was 63 years old, and he had spent 40 of those winters in the Bethel backcountry, and he said it the way other men say grace, quiet and certain, like it mattered more than the words themselves. Then he stepped past the last of the porch light, and the tree line closed around him the way still water closes over a dropped stone. That was 9 minutes before the howling started. I have replayed those 9 minutes more times than I can count, and I still cannot tell you what I would have done differently, only that I would have grabbed his sleeve and I would not have let go. I have carried a ranger badge in this valley for 11 years. I have pulled hikers out of ravines and thawed frostbitten fingers and zipped more than one body into a bag while the family stood at the trailhead and would not stop screaming. I thought I understood what this land could take from a person. I was wrong about that, and I am going to tell you exactly how wrong, and I am going to tell you plainly because there is a part of me that believes if enough people know the shape of the thing, it will have fewer places left to hide. Before I go on, I want to say one thing to whoever is listening in the quiet part of the night. If this account holds you the way it is meant to, follow along here on Sar Bel Ho and on Mr. Bel Ho and drop a comment telling me the name of the woods you grew up near, because every one of them has a story like this buried in it somewhere. If you crave the older tales, the ones your grandparents warned you about, Mr. Geronimo is the place for those. Leave a like so the next person finds this before they go walking where they should not. And now let me take you back to Bethel, and to the season the forest stopped pretending. It began the 3rd week of October. The tourists had thinned out, and the maples had gone the color of a struck match, and the air had that clean cold edge that makes a person feel like the whole world is holding its breath. William came to the station on a Tuesday. He was not a man who came to the station. He preferred the ridge cabin, the one his family had held since before the park drew its lines, and he came down only for salt and coffee and to complain about the young rangers, of whom I was one, even at 40. He set his hands flat on my desk. His knuckles were the size of walnuts and just as hard. He told me the deer had left the North Basin, not thinned, left. He told me he had walked the whole ridge and found no scat, no browse, no beds, and that in 40 years he had never seen the deer abandon good winter ground while the acorns still lay thick on it. Something, he said, had moved into the basin, something that made the deer decide that starving somewhere else was the safer arithmetic. I asked him what he thought it was. He looked at me for a long moment, and there was something in his face I had not seen there before. A kind of embarrassment, the look of a proud man about to say a thing he knows will make him sound foolish. He told me he had found a track by the beaver dam, a print pressed into the mud at the waterline. He said it was shaped like a dog, but longer than his boot, and that above the pad where the dew claw should sit on a wolf, the mud held the clear mark of a heel. Not a dew claw, a heel, like a man leaves, except the toes ended in points that had sunk a full inch into the clay. I told him a bear can leave a strange print in soft ground, that the front and back paws overlap and fool the eye. He nodded like he had expected me to say exactly that. Then he told me the deer knew the difference between a bear and this, and that I would do well to learn it faster than they had. I should have gone up to the basin that same afternoon. I want that on the record. I told him I would send a team out in the morning to survey the deer trails, and I told myself it was a matter of resources, and it was easier to believe that than to admit I did not want to walk into cold woods on the word of an old man and a smear of mud. William understood me completely. That is the part one cannot forgive. He looked at me the way you look at a boy who has decided to touch the stove, with pity and with the knowledge that no words will reach him, and he said he would wait at the station and walk me up himself once the sun was properly down and the thing was moving, because you cannot track what will not stir. We waited on the porch as the light bled out of the sky. I had 2 other rangers with me that evening. James Smith, 34, who had transferred up from the desert parks and still flinched at how loud the northern silence could be, and Emily Johnson, 38, our best tracker, a woman who could read a scuff on granite like other people read a page. We drank coffee and William told stories, and for a while it was good, the kind of evening that makes you remember why you took a badge instead of a desk. Then the coffee went cold in my hands, and William stopped talking mid-sentence, and he tilted his head toward the tree line the way a person does when they hear their own name spoken in another room. He stood. He set his cup down without looking at it. He told us, very softly, to stay on the porch and keep the light behind us, and then, before any of us could ask him why, he walked down the steps and into the yard and across it toward the black wall of the trees, calling out a single word I did not understand, a word that was not English, a word he must have learned from someone a long time before any of us were born. 9 minutes. That is how long the quiet held. Then the howling started, and it did not come from a throat that any dog owns. I need you to understand what that sound did to the animal part of me, because everything else that happened flows out of it. A wolf howls to be heard across a valley, and there is a loneliness in it, a reaching. This was the opposite of reaching. This was a sound that wanted you to know exactly where it was, that it was close, and that it did not care what you did with the knowing. It started low, under the register where hearing ends and the body simply feels, and it climbed, and inside the climb there were shapes that came too near to words. James Smith had his flashlight out and his hand was shaking so hard the beam jittered across the yard like a trapped moth. We called William's name. We called it until our voices cracked. Emily wanted to go in after him, and I held her back. And I have asked myself since whether I did that to save her or because I was too afraid to go in alone and needed a reason to keep her beside me. The howling stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and then there was nothing but the drip of the gutter and the enormous listening dark of the forest, and William Rodriguez did not answer, and did not answer, and did not answer. We found his boot at first light, just the one, 40 feet inside the tree line, standing upright in the leaf litter as if he had stepped out of it and floated away. There was no blood, there was no drag mark, there was a print in the soft ground beside it, and it was exactly as he had described it to me the day before. The long dog shape and the heel and the 4 points sunk deep, except that this one was fresh, and it was the length of my forearm, and there were a great many of them, and they did not walk the way a 4-legged thing walks. They walked upright, left, right, left, the stride longer than any man could throw a leg. I called in a search. This is what we are trained to do. And there is a comfort in the procedure, in the grids and the radios and the orange vests, a comfort that lasts right up until the procedure fails. By noon I had 8 people fanned across the North Basin. Michael Williams, 45, our fire warden, a slab of a man who had never in my memory been afraid of anything. Jessica Garcia, 41, from the county sheriff's office, who brought a rifle and the flat calm of someone who has seen the worst of what people do to each other. Robert Wilson, 47, a volunteer from the town, a hunter who knew the basin nearly as well as William had. Amanda Clark, 36, our wildlife biologist who I had called because I still, God help me, wanted this to be an animal, a known animal, a thing with a Latin name and a place in a book. And Ashley Martinez, 47, a search and rescue lead from 2 counties over, the best in the region, who arrived with dogs. The dogs would not enter the basin. I want to be precise about this, because it is the moment I stopped being able to lie to myself. Ashley had 4 search hounds, animals bred and trained across generations to walk into anything on a scent. They came off the truck happy, tails going, noses down. They followed William's trail to the edge of the North Basin, to a line you could almost have drawn on the ground, and there they stopped, not confused, not casting for a lost scent. They stopped and they sat and they began, all 4 of them, to shake. One of them urinated where it sat and did not seem to notice. Ashley knelt beside her lead dog, a big male she had run for 6 years, and the dog turned its head and pressed its face into her chest and would not look at the trees. She looked up at me, and this was a woman who had recovered children from the bottoms of frozen lakes, and she said very quietly that in 20 years she had never seen a dog refuse, not once. Amanda Clark did not like that. I could see it working on her. She was a person of measurements and controls, of things you could weigh and name, and a dog refusing a scent was not a measurement, it was a mood, and moods have no place in a report. She crouched by the print at the tree line and photographed it with a ruler laid beside it, and she talked to herself while she worked, the way she did, listing the animals it could not be. Not a wolf, the heel was wrong. Not a bear, the stride was wrong. Not a cougar, the toes were wrong. She kept arriving at the edge of what it could not be, and she kept refusing to step off that edge into what it might be, and I understood her completely because I was standing on the same edge, and the drop on the other side of it was very long. Jessica Garcia said nothing while the rest of us argued. She had unslung her rifle, and she stood facing the tree line with the flat readiness of a person who has learned that the worst harm in the world comes without warning and wears an ordinary face. When Robert Wilson made a joke to break the tension, something about William having wandered off after a woman, Jessica did not laugh, and her not laughing landed harder on all of us than any warning could have. She had walked into a great many bad rooms in her years with the county, and I watched her read this tree line the way she would read a bad room, and I watched her decide, without saying it, that she did not like the exits. We went in without them. The basin in daylight should have been beautiful. Cold sun through bare birch, the ground gold with fallen leaves, the beaver pond flat as poured glass. But the wrongness William had described sat over all of it like a held note. No birds, no squirrels working the acorn mast. No wind, though the tops of the pines on the far ridge were moving. The silence was not empty, it was occupied. It was the silence of a room where someone is standing very still behind the door, and every animal instinct I owned was screaming at me to leave, and I made my people walk deeper into it, because a boot and a print are not a body, and until there is a body, we search. Robert Wilson found the deer around 3 in the afternoon. He did not shout. He made a small sound, a sound like a man who has been struck in the stomach. And we came to him through the trees and we saw what he was looking at. They were in the low ground past the pond, a whole herd, more deer than any of us could quickly count, 40 animals or 50, and they were dead. Not shot, not sick. There was not a wound on most of them. They were simply dead, lying where they had fallen, some of them in the middle of a step with their legs still folded to run, their eyes open and clouded, and every single one of them was pointed the same direction. They had all been running the same way, away from something, and they had all dropped at the same instant, as if the running had simply stopped being permitted. Amanda Clark knelt over the nearest doe. Her hands, which I had watched perform necropsies without a tremor, were not steady. She turned the animal's head, and she said the word aloud, the word for what she was seeing, and it was a word that meant the heart had burst, every one of them. Their hearts had burst inside their chests from running that was not fast enough, from a fear that had exceeded the body's capacity to hold it. She looked up at me, and the sun was going down behind her, and she asked me the question I did not have an answer to. She asked what could frighten 50 deer to death at once, and drive them all in one direction, and then let them lie. I walked among them while she worked. I did not want to, but there is a part of a ranger that has to look, that has to count and record even when every other part is trying to leave. And the closer I looked, the worse it became, because it was not only that they had died, it was the order of them. Deer that die of sickness scatter. Deer that die in a hard winter fall where the cold finds them, alone, in the shelter they crawled to. These animals had fallen in formation, a great desperate arrowhead of bodies all aimed south and west, toward the low ground, toward the beaver pond, toward the very line William had marked with his first print. As if in the last instant of their lives every one of them had known precisely where safety lay and had died reaching for it and come up short. And a thing that can do that can take a whole herd and point it and stop it, is not hunting for food. A predator that kills for food kills one. This had killed 50 and eaten none. It had done it, as near as I could tell, for the same reason a person stacks stones on a boundary, to be understood. To say without words that everything past this line belongs to me. Robert Wilson had not moved from where he first found them. He was a hunter, a man who had field-dressed more deer than the rest of us combined, a man entirely at ease with death by the natural order of things, and he stood over that silent herd with his hat in his hands like a man at a graveside, and when I came up beside him he said only that he had never in his life been afraid of these woods, and that he was afraid now, and that he wanted me to know he had said so while it was still light enough to see my face. I have thought about that many times. He was the first of us to say the word aloud. He was also the first of us that it took. That was when Emily Johnson called from the tree line that she had found where William went. And her voice was wrong. Her voice had the same shape as the sound James Smith had made on the porch. And I looked at the sky, and I understood with a plunging certainty that we had spent our daylight, and that whatever had emptied this basin of everything living was going to wake very soon, and that we were standing in the middle of its larder when it did. Emily was standing at the base of a white pine, the biggest in the basin, an old-growth giant that must have been standing when the first surveyors drew the county lines. She was looking up. We followed her eyes. 15 feet up the trunk, where no bear can climb and no man can reach, William Rodriguez's coat had been driven onto a broken branch. Just the coat. It hung there like a scarecrow, arms spread, and the wind that we could not feel on the ground was moving it, so that the empty sleeves lifted and fell, and for one sick moment every one of us believed we were looking at a man still alive and pinned. Below the coat the bark of the pine had been raked, 4 parallel grooves, gouged so deep the pale wood showed through, and they ran from above Emily's reach all the way down to the roots, and the spacing between them was wider than my spread hand. Something had put the coat up there. Something had wanted us to find it. And something had marked the tree beneath it the way a bear marks its territory, except a bear marks as high as it can reach on 4 legs, and these marks began where a very tall thing had reached up while standing. Michael Williams, our fire warden, the man who feared nothing, said we were leaving. He did not phrase it as a suggestion. He was already turning, already gathering us with his arms the way you heard children, and I did not argue with him. And I want you to know that I have never in my life been so grateful to be told what to do. We formed up, and we moved back toward the trailhead, and the light was failing fast now, the gold gone gray, and the shadows of the birches lying long across the leaves like bars. We did not all make it out. It took Robert Wilson first, and it took him from the middle of the line, which is the thing I still cannot make my mind accept. Not the rear, the middle. One moment he was 3 feet behind Jessica Garcia, close enough that she felt the air move, and then there was a sound, not a scream, a short wet exhalation. The sound of a candle being pinched, and when Jessica turned he was gone. No blood, no mark on the leaves. A hunter of 30 years lifted out of the center of a line of 8 armed and watching people without a single one of us seeing the thing that did it. Jessica had her rifle up and she was turning in a slow circle and her lips were moving and no sound was coming out. Then it howled again. And this time it was among us. I have tried many times to describe how a thing that large moved that quietly, and the closest I can come is this. Have you ever watched an owl take a mouse? The mouse never hears it. There is no beat of wings, no warning, only the world before and the world after, and the difference between them is a life. That is how it moved through us. We were 8, and then we were 7, and the 7 of us broke and ran, and running was exactly what it wanted, because I understood in that moment that this was how the deer had died. It herds. It builds the fear until the body governs the mind, and then it lets the fear do the killing, and it walks behind you at its leisure and collects. I grabbed Amanda Clark by the collar because she had frozen, and I hauled her forward, and we ran through the gray woods with the howling folding in on us from the left and the right. 2 throats now, or 1 throat that could throw its voice, I could not tell. James Smith was ahead of me and to my right, and he was making a sound as he ran, a thin continuous note pressed out between his teeth, and I have come to understand that it was the sound of a mind trying to hold itself together while the ground of the world drops away beneath it. He had come north from the desert parks to get away from what people do to each other. He had told me once that the worst thing he had ever seen was a man, and that he had come here because the wilderness at least was honest, that it killed you by accident and never by design. I watched that belief leave him as he ran, because this was design. Every step of it was design, and he knew it, and there was nowhere left in the world for him to go where the honest wilderness would take him back. Branches opened my face. I did not feel them. Ashley Martinez was ahead of me, and she was fast, faster than a woman her age had a right to be, moving with the economy of someone who has run for her life before, and I fixed on her back and I made my legs match hers, and I did not look at the trees because I knew, the way you know a thing in a nightmare, that if I saw its face I would stop. and stopping was death. We came out of the tree line into the yard of the station as full night dropped, and the sensor lights blazed on, and we fell against the walls of the building gasping, and I turned and did the count, and it was the worst arithmetic of my life. James Smith, Emily Johnson, Amanda Clark, Ashley Martinez, Jessica Garcia, Michael Williams, and me. 7 had run and 7 had reached the yard, and I let myself feel one heartbeat of relief before I remembered that 7 had run because Robert Wilson had already been taken, and that meant we had lost only one more in the flight. And I looked back at the black line of the forest just as the sensor lights caught something at the edge of it. It was standing upright. It stood where a man stands, on 2 legs, but it was too tall, half again the height of a tall man, and its shoulders were wrong, hunched and heavy and canted forward. And its head was the head of a dog, long in the muzzle, the ears high and swept back, and its eyes caught the light and threw it back at us in 2 coins of cold green fire. It did not charge. It did not need to. It stood at the boundary of the light it would not enter, and it watched us, and it lifted its long muzzle, and it did the thing that broke something in James Smith that never mended. It laughed, not a howl, a sound of open, rhythmic pleasure, low and huffing. The sound a large dog makes when it is happy, when it has cornered the thing it was chasing and knows the chase is won. And then it stepped backward, once, and the shadow took it, and the green coins winked out, and we were alone in the ring of the sensor lights with the whole night in front of us and no way out that did not go through the trees. We barricaded ourselves in the station. I want to walk you through those hours honestly, because it is in those hours that I learned the second terrible thing about the creature in the Bethel Basin, worse in its way than the killing. The first thing was that it was fast and quiet and strong. The second thing was that it was patient and that it was smart and that it understood us far better than we understood it. The station is a log building, solid, with steel doors we could bar and windows too small for anything large to breach. We killed the sensor lights because James Smith could not stop staring out at where the eyes had been, and the staring was unmaking him. We had radios. We had 2 rifles and Jessica's sidearm. We had heat. By every measure of the training I have received, we were in a defensible position, and help was a phone call away. And I got on the radio and I made that call. And this is where I learned that the thing had been listening. The dispatcher answered. I gave our location and our situation, and I heard her begin to key up a response, and then the line filled with a sound. It came over the radio. It came over the emergency band, on a frequency that a wild animal cannot know exists, cannot manipulate, and yet the howling poured out of the speaker and drowned the dispatcher's voice and rose until Michael Williams reached over and turned it off with a hand that was no longer steady. We tried 3 more times. Each time, the moment we keyed the radio to send, the sound was there waiting, as if it sat on the frequency, as if it understood that the box in our hands was the string that led to the rest of the world, and it had simply taken hold of the far end. I do not know how to explain that. I have stopped trying. I am only telling you what happened. Around midnight it began to test us, not with force, with sound. It circled the station, and I could track it by the crunch of the frozen leaves, a slow, deliberate pace, and as it walked it made sounds, and the sounds were the thing that came nearest to breaking all of us. It called out in William Rodriguez's voice, perfectly. His exact voice, the gravel of it, the way he clipped his words, calling from the tree line that he was hurt, that he had gotten away, that he needed us to open the door. Ashley Martinez put her hands over her mouth. Then it used Robert Wilson's voice. It called to Jessica by her first name in Robert's voice. And Jessica Garcia, who had sat calm through the deer and the coat in the tree, made a sound I hope never to hear from a person again and slid down the wall to the floor. The worst of it, the thing I have never told anyone until now, is that near the end of that long hour it used a voice it should not have had. It called out in the tree line, soft and pleading, in the exact voice of Amanda Clark, who was sitting 3 feet from me on the station floor, alive, her hands over her ears. It called her own voice from outside the wall while she sat inside it. And Amanda took her hands from her ears and looked at me with an expression I have no word for, because there is no word for hearing yourself begging to be let in from the country of the dead while you are still among the living. It had listened to her speak in the basin over the bodies of the deer, and it had kept her, the way it had kept the others, and it was showing her what it intended to make of her. A voice on the wrong side of the door, a thing that calls in a stolen shape. It had heard them speak. In the woods, in the running, it had listened to us call each other's names, and it had kept those voices, and now it was giving them back to us as bait. This is not what an animal does. An animal does not learn your name in an afternoon and use it against you at midnight. And I understood, sitting on that floor with my people coming apart around me, that we had never been hunting it. We had walked into the basin as a search party, and it had let us find exactly what it wanted us to find: the boot, the coat, the raked tree, each thing placed to draw us deeper and hold us until the light was gone. We had been herded all day. We had been the deer all along. Amanda Clark, our biologist, was the one who kept her mind. I will always love her for it. She sat beside me and she talked, low and steady, and she made herself think, because thinking was the only wall she had left. She said that whatever it was territorial. That everything about the deer and the marked tree spoke of a thing announcing ownership of ground. She said that meant it had a range, and a range has an edge, and if we could reach the edge, we could reach the country beyond it where the thing would not follow. She said William had known this. William had said the deer chose to starve elsewhere rather than share the basin, which meant there was an elsewhere, a line the creature would not cross. And she asked me the question that decided everything that came after. She asked me where William had first found the track. The beaver dam. He had found the first print at the beaver dam, at the water line, at the far southern edge of the basin, not the center, the edge. He had been showing me, without knowing it, the boundary of the thing's world, and the road out, the fire road that led down the mountain to the town, and the lights and the rest of the living world, ran along the ridge above that same southern edge. To reach it, we would have to cross the basin in the black of night, the whole width of the killing ground, on foot, with a thing that wore our friends' voices walking somewhere in the trees beside us. Or we could stay and wait for a rescue that could not hear us over the sound the creature poured into every radio we owned, and be taken one at a time from inside the walls the way Robert had been taken from the middle of the line, because I no longer believed for one moment that steel doors would stop it if it decided the game had gone on long enough. I put it to them, all 6 of them. I told them what I believed and what I feared, and I told them I would not order anyone into those trees, that we would go together or we would stay together, and that they should choose. And while they were choosing, from the tree line, in the voice of William Rodriguez, the thing began, very softly, to laugh. We went at the coldest hour, the one before dawn, when the body most wants to sleep and the creature, we prayed, might be least expecting motion. We went roped together at the waist with climbing line so that nothing could be lifted silently from the middle of us again. Michael Williams took the front with a rifle. I took the rear with the other. Jessica held the center with her sidearm and her flashlight, and Emily, our tracker, called the route in a whisper, because if anyone could thread us across that basin in the black, it was her. James Smith, Amanda Clark, and Ashley Martinez walked the line between us, 7 souls on a single rope, stepping out of the light and into the dark that I have spent this whole telling trying not to name, because naming it gives it too much, and there is not a word cold enough anyway. The basin at night was a drowned world. Our lights carried only a few feet before the black drank them. We could see the ground and the nearest trunks and nothing beyond, and out past the edge of the light we could hear it. It paced us. It did not hide the sound anymore. It walked where we walked, off to the right, matching our slow progress step for step, and every so often it would drift closer and the crunch of its tread would come from just outside the reach of the beams, and we would feel the size of it in the dark, the way you feel a truck pass on a narrow road with your eyes closed. The crossing lasted a lifetime, and it lasted no time at all. In the way of the worst hours, where each minute is an age and the whole of it is over before you can grasp that it began. Emily called the route in a thread of a whisper. Left around the deadfall, down the slope, mined the roots, and we moved as one long careful animal through ground that wanted us dead. Twice we stopped because the pacing in the dark had stopped, and a still creature is worse than a moving one, because a moving one you can place, and a still one could be anywhere, could be a single stride from your shoulder, breathing the same cold air. Each time, after a silence that stretched until I could hear the blood in my own ears, the crunch of the leaves would begin again, unhurried, patient, and we would let out the breath we had been holding and go on. And I understood that the stopping was deliberate too, that it had learned we could not bear the silence, and it was spending our courage a coin at a time. Ashley Martinez was the one who kept the line moving when the rest of us wanted to freeze. She had spent her life walking toward the thing everyone else walks away from, into the water, into the collapse, into the place where the lost are, and some part of that training held even now. She would put a hand on the shoulder ahead of her and press gently forward, and her steadiness ran up the rope and into all of us and kept us walking when the mind said stop and lie down and let it be over. I have thought since that she saved every life that came off that mountain, and that she never once said so, and that this is the exact shape of the bravest people I have known. We were halfway across when it took Michael Williams, and it took him to teach us that the rope would not save us. He was at the front, the strongest of us, the rifle up and ready, and it came not from the side where it had been pacing but from directly ahead, out of the black where our lights should have shown it, and somehow did not, and it was on him before he could fire. The rope snapped taut and hauled the whole line forward off our feet, and I was dragged 3 yards through the leaves before the line went slack. And when Jessica's light found the front of the rope, there was only the frayed end of it, cut clean, and Michael's rifle lying in the leaves, and Michael gone. It had cut the rope. It had reached into the middle of our one defense and severed the man from the line and taken him and left the rest of us tumbled in the leaf litter, and from the dark ahead came the huffing laugh, closer now, delighted, and beneath it, wet and brief, a sound I will not describe. Something in me went past fear then, into a country on the other side of it, a flat gray calm. I got them up. I got the rope retied. I put myself at the front where Michael had been, and I told them in a voice I did not recognize as mine to walk, to keep walking, that the edge was close, that William had stood at that beaver dam and the thing had not crossed the water there, and that water was ahead of us and we were going to reach it. I do not know if I believed it. I know that belief is not required to put one foot in front of another, and that sometimes the body has more courage than the mind that rides it. We reached the beaver pond as the sky in the east went the faint gray of ash, and the creature made its last mistake, and it was a mistake born of the same thing that had made it toy with us all along. It was too sure. It had herded 100 deer and it had never had one turn, and it had walked among people who ran, and it had come to believe that we were only a slower kind of deer. So when we reached the water and turned south along the dam toward the fire road, it stepped out of the trees behind us into the open, into the gray light, to finish us where it could watch, and for the first time we saw the whole of it standing clear. I will give you only what you need. It stood taller than the doorway of my station. It walked on 2 legs that bent backward at the knee like a dog's hind legs, and its arms hung long and heavy and ended in hands, true hands, with fingers that folded around the trunk of a young birch as it steadied itself, and those fingers ended in the points that had sunk an inch into the clay. Its head was the head of a great dog, and its eyes in the dawn were not green now but a wet and human brown, and that was the worst of it. That was the thing that told me William had been right at the very start and I had been a fool. It looked at me. It looked me directly in the eye across the gray water, and I remembered what the old man had told me on the porch before he walked into the trees. A dog will not look you in the eye unless it wants something. It wanted me to run. It wanted the fear. It had built its whole life on the certainty that the looked-at thing always breaks and bolts and dies. And so I did the one thing it had never seen a deer do. I raised Michael Williams's rifle, which I had carried across the whole Black Basin, and I did not run. And I looked back into that terrible human eye, and I fired. I am not going to tell you that I killed it. I want to more than I have wanted anything, but this is a true account, and the truth is that I do not know what the bullet did. It struck. I know it struck because the thing across the water flinched, a small sharp motion, more surprise than pain, and it made a sound I had not heard from it before, a short high note with nothing of laughter in it. And in the half-second that it was surprised, we ran, all 6 of us, along the dam and up the bank and onto the fire road, and the fire road ran downhill toward the town, and we ran down it into the growing light, and did not stop until the trees fell away and we came out above the valley and saw, spread below us in the last of the night, the small ordinary lights of Bethel going about the business of being alive. It did not follow us onto the road. Amanda had been right. It had a range, and the range had an edge, and the edge held. We stood on the fire road above the town as the sun came up. 6 of us where the day before there had been more, and no one said a word, because there were no words, and we watched the light come up over the country that the thing did not own, and we breathed, and being alive felt like a debt we had not earned and would spend the rest of our years failing to repay. The search for William Rodriguez, and for Robert Wilson, and for Michael Williams was called off after 11 days. Nothing was ever found. Not a boot, not a coat, not a mark. The basin, when the teams went in by daylight in force, was empty and ordinary and green, the dead deer gone too, every one of them, dragged off or carried, an entire herd vanished from open ground. The official report speaks of a bear, of terrain, of the well-documented way that grief and exhaustion distort the memories of survivors. I signed that report. I put my name to the bear and the terrain because the alternative was a truth that no page would hold, and because I have learned that the world protects itself from things like this by refusing to write them down. So I am writing this instead, here, where it can be heard and not filed. James Smith left the service that winter. He does not answer my calls. Jessica Garcia transferred to a desk 200 miles from any forest. Ashley Martinez retired and gave away her dogs, all but the big male that had pressed its face to her chest at the edge of the basin, and she keeps that one close, and she says it still will not go into deep woods, and she has stopped asking it to. Emily Johnson and Amanda Clark and I still speak on the hard nights, the ones near the turn of October when the maples go the color of a struck match, because there are things you can only say to the people who were on the rope with you, and there is a comfort in a voice that does not need the whole thing explained. I have thought a great deal about the old man's saying in the years since, "A dog will not look you in the eye unless it wants something." I understood it, that night at the water, as a warning about the creature, about the moment the hunter shows its face. But I have come to fear that it meant something else, something William knew and could not say, something he walked into the trees to answer. Because the basin is quiet now, the deer have come back, and every October, on the night the cold gets its clean edge, I stand on my porch at the edge of the tree line, and I do not go in, and I do not call out, and I keep the light behind me the way he taught me. But some nights, late, at the very border of the censer lights, 2 coins of cold green catch and hold, and it does not howl, it does not laugh. It only stands, half again the height of a tall man, and it looks at me across the yard, directly into my eyes, patient, the way it looked at me across the water. And each year it stands a little longer before the shadow takes it back. It is waiting for something. I know that now. I know it wants something. And I have begun to understand, on the coldest of those nights, with the badge heavy on my chest and the warm, safe light of the living world at my back, that the terrible thing is not that I do not know what it wants. The terrible thing is that some part of me has started to want to walk down the steps and go and find out. That is where I will leave you. If you made it this far, you already know the woods behind your own house better than you let yourself admit, and you know the sound they make when they go too quiet. Follow along here on SR Bellico and on Mr. Bellico, and if the old tales are what call to you, the ones about the things that had names before we came, Mr. Geronimo is waiting. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done at the water, whether you would have run or turned. And do me one kindness. When the deer leave good ground, do not tell yourself it